Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto learned how to handle a spontaneous personality like Ino. Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Hanahakagure no Sato. They never saw him, they never did. How could they? He never allowed them to. No one except a handful. And of those privileged individuals, half were currently outside the walls of the village. And another was aware of his current intentions, which left only one. He was the only one Naruto ever allowed to recognize him. The others were all far superior to him to be deceived by his mask. He was the only one not to judge him, yet also the only one not to know the entirety of the truth. And that was why Naruto trusted him, because he was one of the few who didn't despise him, one of the few who didn't look down on him, as if he were the root sum of all that was wrong with their lives, as if he wasn't protecting them all simply by just having a beating heart. He subconsciously moved his eyes towards the subject of his thought, engaged in a poor attempt to camouflage himself in all black attire at the entrance of the adult bookstore. A smile crept its way across his face, and he snorted to himself, Iruka-sensei is such a closet pervert. The boy broke himself out of his reverie to rescan his surroundings. His choice of terrain had been intentional. The casual passerby would fail to see the small orange bodysuit perched atop Mount Hokage. I know that isn't the actual name, I just think it sounds cool. He had deliberately chosen that spot and garbed himself in those clothes. At dawn, the fading sun cast its titanic illumination upon Mount Hokage, affording a cloak of secrecy to any inhabitants, which was further augmented by the orange eyesore worn by the currently sole occupant of the giant mountain. Naruto loved Konoha this time of day. The receding orange light of the sun cast the village in an orange dye, making him feel like he was watching a live and moving oil painting. Yet he was not there to gaze at the sights. No, his true intention was something far more important. Yesterday, at a private meeting with the Hokage, he had been informed that there was a traitor within the ranks of the Konohakagure no Sato Shinobi Academy, and that his mission was to draw and capture the traitor, alive if possible. Naruto had the trust of his leader and hence was given full freedom to sort out the specifics of the mission, and he had not disappointed devising a plan that Danzo himself would be proud of. He was well aware that all the shinobi teachers bar Iruka-sensei had deliberately tried to sabotage his development by not paying attention to him or by failing him repeatedly in exams. Thus, his plan was to fail the graduation exam this way, any unneeded attention would not be drawn his way and he would be safe to carry out his ingenuity. For Naruto was not the dumb, loud-mouthed prankster everyone took him to be. He was aware of his heritage as the sole heir of the fourth, as well as the only known remaining Uzumaki, and most of all, of his status as a Jinchuriki or the power of human sacrifice, someone chosen as a vessel for one of the 9 great and terrible tailed beasts. He was also aware of the numerous attempts to sabotage both his academic and personal life by shinobi and civilians alike, and, therefore, since the time he had started at the academy, had been the personal spy of the Sandaime Hokage, his grandfather in all but flesh and blood. As a light breeze passed by, Naruto picked up a slight disturbance in the wind. He silently smirked, the mission was on. Mizuki was glad he hadn't given up his search, for it had finally paid off. He saw the demon brat sitting with his back to him. Wearing a malicious grin, he silently approached the boy, gripping the boy's shoulder with fake sympathy. "Hey Naruto, how are you?" he asked, his voice filled with fake concern. The boy slumped his shoulders and answered without looking at him, "I failed the exam again, Mizuki-sensei." "Why?" "I studied so hard this time. It's so unfair." Mizuki narrowed his eyes at this. Naruto barely ever paid attention in class, instead opting to play cheap parlor tricks on the hapless residents of this village. Anyway, none of that mattered now, not when he so was close to his goal. "Don't be disheartened Naruto, you gave it your all." "It doesn't matter, Iruka-sensei still failed me," the demon sniffled, wiping his nose off with his sleeve. Mizuki put a hand on his shoulder in a fraud offering of sympathy. "I understand, in fact, I'll let you in on a big secret." If Mizuki had been any wiser, he'd have noticed the slightest of smirks on his former student's face. Just as he was about to leave, he remembered the most important detail and called back Ho and Naruto, "Make your way over to Training Ground 44, I'll find you there." Once he left, Naruto set for the Hokage Tower with to inform the Sandaime of his former teacher's treachery. Midnight, Training Ground 44, Aka the Forest of Death. The death-like vice of silence over Training Ground 44 was disturbed by the rustling of leaves and shaking of branches. The seed of this disturbance was a black-clad figure streaking across the ominously named Forest of Death. Said figure stopped its movements, surveying the oppressant area around him, and decided to halt. Naruto took off his mask and took out a seemingly generic scroll. Doing the one-handed Kage Bunshin seal, he unsealed the scroll of sealing. He'd been running for a while, and he was sure it would take another hour or so for the next shift of security to start duty. and in about 15 minutes time, the daily cleaning crew would have arrived and wiped away any evidence that he was in the Hokage residence. In other words, it was the perfect crime. Except for one variable, the criminal was not looking to get away with his crimes, he was stealing for the security of his home. Having nothing better to do, he opened up the giant scroll and set about perusing its contents. Well, Gigi never said not to open the scroll, he mentally told himself. A small section at the bottom of a page caught his eye and he looked closer, finding the word Shikabane no Jutsu written in barely legible script. It's in Naruto, but I wanted to show it here. This piqued his curiosity. A jutsu like this would have near unlimited capabilities, especially against opponents without the use of chakra. He removed an empty scroll and copied down the contents on the original scroll. To his puzzlement, his pen didn't work. He replaced it with another, which still wouldn't write. He scribbled gibberish onto the empty scroll, which appeared just fine. Then why couldn't he write the technique of the jutsu down? In all his admittedly short time as a shinobi, he had never experienced anything like this, nor had he expected to encounter anything like this, and he was sure this bizarre occurrence was down to one of the ninja arts. The blonde refocused his attention of the forbidden scroll, flipping its pages till he got to the end, where he found of all things, a post-it note stuck to the sheet. Let's just pretend post-it notes exist in Naruto. He read the contents of the note and didn't know whether to marvel at the genius of the note's author or to rip it out in sheer frustration. Now Naruto-kun, better men than you have tried and failed to copy the scroll of seals. You didn't think it would be so easy, did you? Well then again, you are still a young gaki, so let me explain something to you. When the forbidden scroll was drawn up, my own sensei, the Nidaime Hokage, Kami bless him, had the insight to devise a mastermind security feature, chakra perception. The Nidaime imbued upon this scroll to detect the chakra of the reader per second and thereby gauge the purity of their emotions and intentions. He also added a feature to prevent anyone from writing down the contents of this scroll. As for how he managed to do that, well, I'll just have to tell you that on my deathbed. Yours faithfully, Sarutobi Hiruzen. He decided to do the latter and moved to tear the note off and found that the note wouldn't budge. Begrudgingly accepting defeat, he mentally vowed retribution. Just you wait, old man, I'm going to get you back for this one. Having no other option, he decided then that in the time it took for Mizuki or someone else to find him, he would have at the very least learned the basics of this jutsu and then move forwards from there. Making a dozen shadow clones, Naruto set about it his task. 1 hour later, Imi no Iruka could feel it almost touch the titanic pool of chakra closing in. He always was an adept sensor. It was the one shinobi Artie had always excelled at, and he was going to need it now more than ever. He'd been woken up at the dead of night by his colleague Mizuki, who told him that their former student Uzumaki Naruto had fled with the forbidden scroll from the Hokage's residence. That had been enough to rouse him from his state of grumbling. Since then, he'd been on the lookout for his wayward former charge. Iruka had a hard time accepting that Naruto could do this. He was a prankster, yes, and he never paid attention in class, but one thing Uzumaki Naruto could never be was a thief, much less the thief of the scroll of sealing. It was with that hope that Iruka had set out, without any weapons, trying to get to the bottom of this mystery in a way that ensured the scroll was found and returned to its rightful place, and that nothing happened to young Naruto. After all, he was his favorite student, not that he would tell anyone. That would be the height of unprofessionalism. But that didn't stop him from silently urging Naruto on, wishing for him to attend and pay attention in classes, for he reminded him a lot of himself. Both were orphans, and in Naruto's case, had never known or seen his parents. Both were pranksters in their youth, not out of wanting to harass others, but because of being starved of any meaningful attention, and as such even insults were preferable to being ignored. Iruka stopped just as he arrived in front of the source of giant chakra. Jinchuriki or not, Naruto's chakra reserve never failed to awe him, and he thanked his stars for the fact that Naruto did not have the ability to make physical clones of himself yet, otherwise it would have been impossible for him to catch the real Naruto. Reminding himself of the boy's stubborn yet delicate state of mind, Iruka halted for a moment before entering the clearing. To his bamboozlement, he saw Mizuki with a scroll of sealing in his hand, his other reaching into his back pocket. He wordlessly slipped back into the bushes, wanting to find out more about the situation before intervening and finding out just what the hell was going on. 5 minutes earlier, Mizuki hastened over the sides of the trees, traveling horizontally so to avoid his shoe prints on the branches. Those fools would never think to check the tree trunks, and by the time they'll think of it, I'll be long gone, he sneered as he could sense a large reservoir of chakra just ahead. Finally he grinned maliciously, the scroll is mine. Deciding to carry on with the act until he could get close enough to the brat, Mizuki adopted the fakest smile he could manage and greeted his soon-to-be victim. Hey there Naruto, I take it you've been working hard, he said, observing the torn and dirtied clothes covering the demon container. The boy gave back an equally fake smile and produced a thumbs up. Absolutely Mizuki-sensei, now I can finally become a genin. Well, that's what I'm here for, now give me the scroll so I can test you. He almost fell over from the sheer weight thrown at him. Disregarding the demon child's freak display of strength, he set the scroll aside and reached for, inside his back pocket, his kunai. "What are you doing, Mizuki-sensei?" "Just taking out my examiner's sheet, don't you worry, Naruto," and just as he took the boy's name, removed his hand out and launched the kunai at the orange-clad figure, seeking to finish the nuisance once and for all. In the bushes, Iruka could see what was about to happen, and he saw Mizuki launch the kunai at their former student. Knowing that he could not stop the kunai in time, he did the only thing he could and jumped at Naruto, hoping to move him out the way. By his fortune, he managed to push Naruto out of the way. By his misfortune, he wasn't able to move out the way in time and was struck in the side, promptly falling to the ground like a sack. Mizuki cursed his luck. Just as he was about to finish the brat, Iruka somehow intercepted it and was hit himself. This was bad. Mizuki had not expected the scar-nosed fool to find them so fast. His plan depended on killing the beast and using the jutsu his benefactor had shown him, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, he'd be well out of Konoha. But this was not the way things could be now. He would have to kill both student and teacher, and quietly, before anyone else learned of their presence in this forest. "Iruka, what are you doing here?" he spat out. What do you think you're trying to do, throwing a kunai at your student like that?" Iruka coughed out, "And why do you have the scroll of seals with you?" Mizuki chuckled at the fool's naivety. "You still don't get it, do you? You were tricked, a mere puppet of my genius. And now, I shall finish off that nuisance hiding behind those trees and take what is mine. If you know what's best for you, you'd stay out the way." Of course there was no way he could let Iruka live, not after what he'd witnessed. But by giving him an out, Mizuki wanted to lull the man into a false sense of security so that when the time came to snuff him away, he'd be less of a hassle. Unfortunately for him, Iruka was not about to go down so easily. He stood up shakily, an arm over his injured side in a protective stance. I won't let you do anything to Naruto," he declared with a newfound strength in his voice. My, looks like the good professor grew a boner too. "And tell me, how do you plan on doing that? Your wound prevents you from overexerting yourself, and if you can't do that then you can't stop me from hunting down that demon fox, and once I kill him, you won't be of this world for much longer either." And with that, Mizuki set off deeper into the forest. No doubt in his mind that was where his prey had headed. Iruka groaned and gave pursuit to him, knowing that he only had one option left. He grinned, this was too easy. Using a simple henge whilst giving chase, he had located his target within a few minutes. He threw kunai at his feet, only to be shocked when the demon jumped and turned around in midair, evaded the kunai intended for his ankles, and fired off one of his own. Mizuki dodged in the nick of time, the kunai grazing his right ear. He frowned, since when was the demon so good at his kunai? As if in response, the demon stopped in front of him and a pair of shuriken, which sliced off the bottom of Mizuki's sandals this time. "How did you know that I was not Iruka?" Naruto gave him a Cheshire grin before bursting into a cloud of smoke, and in his stead appeared Iruka. Mizuki growled and fisted his hands. "Why would you look out for that monster? The one who killed your parents." Up from the treetops, Naruto was hearing in on this conversation, waiting for the right moment to strike. Below, Iruka was leaning onto a tree, having lost copious amounts of blood. He would survive, but his chances were slimming with every passing moment. Mizuki seemed to be egging him on to curse his parents' killer, meaning Naruto's tenant, and by consequence Naruto himself. It was this that Naruto was listening for. Whether or not his trust was justified, or if the people in this village who hated him would add another member to their ranks. You know, whether I or that demon fox take it, the impact would be the same. This scroll imparts limitless power to the one who wields it. There's no way that Naruto, the monster fox, won't use its powers. You're right, Iruka conceded. Above them, Naruto closed his eyes in dejection. But the following words would change Naruto's life forever if he was a monster fox. But Naruto is different. He's a hardworking student who I recognize. He's earnest, clumsy, and because of his burden shunned by everyone. That's why he knows the pain of others. That's why he's not a monster fox, he is Uzumaki Naruto of Konohakagure no Sado. In the years to come, Naruto would vehemently deny any such accusations, but in that moment for the first time in years he shed tears of joy, of relief, and above all for being accepted. Naruto wiped his tears and put on his mask, sliding down the tree with a kunai, slinking into a hedge underneath. Mizuki took the Fuma shuriken off his back, spun it with his fingers and charged at Iruka, intent on finishing him off for good this time. Instead, just as he was about to sever the man's head off, he was violently struck on the nose and thrown back about 20 feet. The shuriken left his hand to slice through the treetops. As he got up, he saw a masked figure in front of him. "Now who the fuck are you?" he growled, wiping the blood off his face. Looking at the person's stature, they couldn't have been bigger than a preteen. The person answered by delivering a blow to his gut, forcing him to expel more blood from his mouth this time. Mizuki lay on the floor groaning, slowly losing consciousness. The last thing he remembered before closing his eyes was the mask being taken off and looking up at a whisker-faced boy with blue eyes and blonde eyes. Realizing the deception, Mizuki gave a silent scream in his mind's what the fuck. Naruto turned his attention to his other former sensei. Haruka himself was on the verge of unconsciousness. He moved towards him, hesitating for a moment before bending down and placing a hand on Haruka's shoulder. Thank you for everything you've ever done for me. You have no idea what you just said means to me. But right now we need to get you to a hospital, Haruka-sensei. He looked back, where a team of Anbu were about to transfer Mizuki over to the T&I department. He nodded his backwards at Haruka-sensei, and a couple of them came over, picking Haruka up his shoulders and ready to leave. Wait, Haruka requested, are you not coming? No, I need to see Hokage-sama. Then I have something to give you. He looked at the Anbu if we could get a moment. The mask-wearing duo understood, gingerly letting go of him and vanishing instantly into the darkness. Close your eyes, Naruto. Why? Just consider it my last instruction to you. Naruto looked him at for a moment before closing his eyes. When he opened them he felt a new weight on his forehead which wasn't there before. He touched his forehead and felt a foreign object, metallic and cool to the touch. A hit. He gasped almost inaudibly. He hugged Haruka-sensei tightly, holding on to him for a good few seconds before letting go, staining Haruka's chunin vest with his tears of gratitude. I'll never forget this, sensei, he promised the elder man, before signaling the Anbu to come over and take Haruka. Once he was alone again, he turned around to pick up a scroll of seals, only to find it not there. He gave a small smile, realizing that he'd once again been played by the Sandaime, this time by having the foresight to instruct the Anbu to take the scroll without Naruto finding out. Sweeping one last glance at the desolate jungle around him, Naruto reattached his mask and left for the Hokage Tower. During the reign of the Sandaime, an incoming visitor would find the office of the Hokage littered with various scrolls on healing and Mokuton jutsu, and dispersed along with them pictures of Hashirama's friends and family, both deceased and living. Among them were the occasional self-help guide on the art of gambling, strategically placed so as not to draw any unwanted attention from the brother of the Hokage or from his beloved wife. When the Nidaime came into office, he donated all of his predecessors' jutsu scrolls to the various education departments of Konoha and burned all the gambling jutsus he knew his brother would only keep them to spite him. Not once had Hashirama ever so much as given a second glance to them. In their stead were shelves decked with books on politics, history, jutsu invention and kinjutsu, which contrary to what you think were not so easily to pilfer the infamous strength of the then guard of the Nidaime Raikage and future Sandaime Raikage, could not bring the books to budge an inch, and as always where the Nidaime was involved, this secret too was never unraveled by an outsider. By the time the Sandaime was elected by his former sensei and Hokage, he elected for a more friendly approach. Gone were the old desks heaving with books whose mere title no one could read out, and in their stead were portraits, some of the most important moments in Konoha's history, and Hiruzen, living up to his title of the professor, had personally written helpful descriptions underneath them, giving the room a museum-like appearance. Years after the maturation and eventual betrayal of one of the Sannin, Danzo would attempt one of his numerous hidden raids of the office, finding in the process hidden behind the portrait stashes of the Icha Icha novel series. For the brief period that the Yondaime occupied this office, it was more reminiscent of the way it was during the rule of Hashirama, only instead this time the Mokuton and healing jutsus were replaced with fan mail and love letters from Kunoichi and Shinobi, not just from the Leaf, but reaching from the notoriously isolationist Cloud and Mist villages, which required shredding weekly, lest the ill-famed wife of his find out and raise the office down again. Hiruzen lay in his chair in a semi-trance-like state, recollecting old memories whilst waiting for his youngest shinobi. The smoke from his pipe wafted around the room and reveled in the pleasing aroma. He heard a slight tap on his door and gave permission to the seeker to enter. A mask-wearing figure walked in and nodded at him. Hiruzen closed his eyes and went through the ritual of bringing up a privacy seal. When completed, he reopened his eyes and nodded back. The person lost their mask to reveal his grandson-like figure. I trust you are alright, Naruto-kun. Not that he had any doubts, but as the Sandaime had taught him, it was always best to begin with an enquiry into the well-being of his shinobi. It reinforced the shinobi's affection and respect for their cage, and as a byproduct, to the village. Hi. I'll accept an official written report tomorrow, but you may give a quick narration of tonight's events. Very well. As you know, the traitor Asakawa Mizuki, couldn't find a canon surname, so just gave him a random one. It means shallow for anyone curious, planned to get away with the scroll of sealing and frame me in the process. Being the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi and having the reputation that I have in this village, it would have been plausible enough to a large number of shinobi that this was within the realm of possibility. Until someone realized that the scroll was still missing. With this in mind, Mizuki divulged to me an apparent second way of passing the genin exam by stealing the scroll of seals and mastering a jutsu in the time it took to be found. In order to ensure maximum intractability, he instructed me to go to Training Ground 44, where the presence and movement of various large creatures make it nigh impossible to detect any traces of outside presence after a day or two. Once I was told of this, I swiftly came to you and arranged a plan where you would be under the pretense of a deep sleep and the shinobi guarding the scroll would be placed under a harmless passive genjutsu by yourself. We had also agreed that, for the duration of this mission, I would be backed up by a guard of Anbu Corps in case something went haywire. Once the guards were out of the equation, I moved in and left with the scroll. Sticking to the various underground tunnels that the route no longer use, I entered the forest and ventured deep inside. I then stopped in a clearing and with my curiosity getting the better of me opened up the scroll in order to learn and note down its contents. To my surprise and disappointment, I couldn't transfer any information from the scroll and then flipped through the pages for an answer as to why. Lo and behold, to my surprise you'd come up with yet another way to torment me, Naruto spat in full rage. Oh, you mean this? Sarutobi smiled, seemingly summoning the forbidden scroll out of nowhere and pointing to his note. Naruto quickly went through a series of hand seals and expelled fire from his mouth, burning the pink square off. The third chuckled and gestured him to continue. I then decided to make shadow clones to learn a jutsu until the time Mizuki came. As I had guessed, he arrived an hour later and would have eliminated one of my clones were it not for the intervention of one Yumi no Ruka, who intercepted the kunai with his own body and injuring himself heavily in the process. I recalled my clone and observed their interaction. Iruka had guessed what had happened and gave chase to Mizuki, who was trying to find and kill me. Iruka hinged himself into me, whereas Mizuki transformed into Iruka, and after a brief chase, Mizuki was about to finish off Iruka. It was at this point that I intervened and neutralized him. The Anbu then received my signal to move in, which they did, and took the prisoner to the T&I department headquarters. Sarutobi pointed to the cool metallic piece atop the boy's forehead, and what of that? Where did you get that from? Iruka-sensei gave it to me. Sarutobi smiled, understanding the development of a new bond between the two. He straightened up then, listening very closely to Naruto's answer to his next question, and what were the shortcomings of your mission plan? Well, I hadn't anticipated that Iruka-sensei would be involved, and because of my misjudgment, an innocent was almost lost today, he admitted. Hi, and you should keep this in mind for future missions. A mission plan is never set in stone and must always be designed to allow for any adjustments or alterations. Your mission plan was, on the basis of the known information, solid, but you should have done further research prior. You could have made clones and done surveillance on the target, could have bugged him or searched his apartment for more information. After that, a more robust plan would have been possible. Hi Professor Sama. Naruto bowed. You look so much like your father. Naruto Hiruzen smiled, now that their professional obligation as Hokage ninja was over, but your eyes, Kami, do they remind me of your mother? So I've been told. Oji-san. Naruto agreed. This was a success, Naruto, and a good education for you. Most shinobi find themselves unable to put ink to paper when tasked to come up with their first ever mission plan. You not only formulated one, but also executed it to near perfection. Keep up your progress, and it won't be long before you'll be in my seat. Thanks, old man. Now go home and get a good night's sleep. You have your team listings at the academy tomorrow. Naruto bowed once more and taking his signal to leave, put his mask back on and exited through the window. Some things never change. Hiruzen chuckled, his mind flashing back to a like-minded boy with white hair and red face markings. Later that night, Konoha T&I headquarters. Contrary to popular belief, the Konoha T&I headquarters was not an underground lair composed of dungeons or torture rooms, it was rather a sleek 5-story building, and at first glance seemed no different to a corporate office. Indeed, its employees did not dress up in shinobi wear or traditional robes, instead having a dress code of suits and trousers and skirts for the ladies. The T&I employees were far more likely to spend their whole professional career filling out request forms for what were termed observational systems, but were in reality extreme pain-causing and often lethal torture weapons. No, only the very best in the business were afforded the opportunity to actually do any T&I activities. And those privileged men and women rarely found themselves in this corporate setting. Instead, those privileged men and women set up office directly underneath this structure in what was the much less known information extraction rooms or ears. For all practical purposes, this was the actual T&I headquarters, an actual underground lair featuring uncountable dungeons separated by cabins for employees and a sporadic storage cabinet for torture instruments. It was inside one of these undistinguishable dungeons that one of the privileged individuals was carrying out his privilege on the body of the traitor Asakawa Mizuki, who was howling and crying for mercy. Not that he would find any, not from Ibiki. He had the screams of 1,000 such clients before, and he would hear the screams of 1,000 more before his time was over. His face belied the true nature of his current activity. He was puffing out from a cigarette every now and then, caressing and drawing smoke from it, as if he were at a social at the Konoha Gents Club, instead of the darkest dungeons in the Land of Fire. As for his client, his outward appearance and behavior was an exact mirror of his inner anguish. The cancerous smoke of 1,000 cigarettes wafted in the air, forcing unbearable coughs out of him. This only exacerbated the pain and intensity of his shrieks and yells, feeling the agony of his body slowly being torn apart. He thrashed and squirmed, unable to remove the tears out of his eyes due to the shackles holding his limbs in place. If Mizuki had known this was the price of capture prior to his mission, he would have never accepted. All those lessons, those long hours spent under his hand, and that slippery assistance. He had been tricked, led astray into believing he would gain a power he now realized could never be his. He could barely hear the voice of his tormentor over his own wails, and it was only after the bastard had grabbed his hair and shoved his face into his that Mizuki could hear him for the last time. "What do you know?" "I already told you, I know nothing," he croaked out. He'd have loved to spit at the disgusting man, so bashful and crude in both appearance and temperament. But he found in this state the mere thought of doing so left him bereft of energy. "Well, we'll find out soon enough," came the reply, as a second figure emerged from him, this one with blue eyes and blonde hair held together in a ponytail. "Well, what? You mean to say all this torture was for nothing? This could have happened from the beginning." "Precisely. Oh, you monster. What kind of sick bastard are you?" Not that Mizuki would ever confess, but the pair of hawk-like stone-gray eyes that glared at him in response had induced the most fear he'd ever felt in his life. "You are lucky that this gentleman here thinks your mind may be of some use, otherwise I would have separated that which makes you a man from the rest of your body by now." Mizuki gulped, feeling waves upon waves of terror overcome his mind. He understood now just why they called this man the bringer of pain. The second man stepped forward, his eyes perusing Mizuki deeply, as if he could enter into his mind without any jutsu. He'd heard of him too. Yamanaka Inoichi, the head of the Mind Walkers division and the foremost mind reader Konoha had seen in generations. "Would you like for him to be unconscious, Yamanaka-san? Later perhaps, I would like him to be awake for now." Before stepping away, Ibiki aimed the butt of his cigarette right between his eyes, drawing out another yell from the chained prisoner. Through watery eyes, Mizuki could see the mind reader come close to him and could feel the touch of 2 fingers to the temple of his head. The Yamanaka uttered the name of some jutsu he couldn't make out, and then all was blank in Mizuki's mind. Inoichi found himself in a dark lair, reeking of serpents and unfamiliar chemicals. "Well, we can finally confirm whose work this is," he thought to himself. Just ahead of him, Mizuki was leaning in front of a throne. On that throne sat a hooded figure, almost hissing out instructions to his disciple. Inoichi went through another set of hand seals. "Kyoku Hoki no Jutsu, an memory retention technique. Please tell me if the Japanese is correct, I'm using Google Translate." As Inoichi listened in on the twisted teachings, he found himself in shock of what he had just listened to. The depravity of that monster. Does he know no bounds? Realizing that this information must be transferred as soon as possible, he removed himself from the mindscape and returned to the world of the flesh. He had always hated this part. Once, his father had described it as being akin to being woken up with a bucket of cold water. And that was exactly how it felt. When he returned, he saw Ibiki leaning against a desk and the prisoner right where he was. Inoichi looked to a seemingly solid wall and gave a gesture to it. Instantaneously, it disappeared and was replaced by the Sandaime Hokage. He looked back to see Ibiki had exited the room. Not that he didn't trust the man, he would trust his life on him, but this was the way the intelligence system worked. No one bar the Hokage and the select others knew the full details. In a world where teenagers could massacre entire populations and one could not trust someone as far as they could throw them, compartmentalization was like holy scripture, it must always be abided by. "How is it, Inoichi?" "It is bad, Hokage-sama. Worse than we had feared." "I see. It is not unexpected, my former student always had a lack of morality." Inoichi passed on what he had heard to his superior, and by the time he had finished a grim look had settled on the wizened old man's face. "Knock him out and this time take me with you." He accepted the command, decking the prisoner in the back of the head and repeating the earlier process, this time accounting for the guest he would take into the realm of the soul. This was the main reason he had a job: the perusal of the unconscious mind. To the average person, including shinobi, the mind was like a box. Open when they were awake and closed when they were asleep. This could not be any further from the truth. The mind was like the wind. It could be slowed, shielded against, or even harnessed. But it could not be stopped. Similarly, the mind never ceased functioning. It could consume information in a subconscious state, only the person would not have any knowledge of that information once they woke up. That information was locked away in the deepest, most concealed recesses of the brain. And Inoichi was the foremost locksmith of that door. This time, the setting was of a laboratory, underground as well. On a table, lay the prone form of the convict Asakawa Mizuki. He was currently being operated on by two mask-wearing figures, both having hidden their faces. One of them was no doubt Orochimaru. The other person was an unknown and for now not the focus of their attention. Once the patient had been stitched up, one of the figures performed a series of hand seals in a strange language that Inoichi could not understand. He could feel the sandame stiffen next to him, meaning he was aware of what was going on. The dark energy shifted throughout the prone body and the memory ended. He had a sense that no further mind walking was required and he extricated the both of them out of Mizuki's mind. The sandame went and took a seat. His face was a shen gray, and this moment he did not look like the god of shinobi the entire village had grown up admiring, but a fragile old man whose mistakes had caught up with him. What is the next course of action, Hokage-sama? The man replied without even looking at him. The boy must die. Understanding who he was referring to, Inoichi took out a kunai and struck it deep within the chained man's heart, snuffing the life out of him. The third signaled for Ibiki to re-enter, and Inoichi looked back at the corpse. To his abject horror, the corpse had fallen to the ground, and the reason for his horror was, the corpse was no longer that of Asakawa Mizuki, but of the container of the nine tails, Konoha's own Uzumaki Naruto. What is this? He managed to ask against all the confusion and sickness. That gentleman is Orochimaru's new technique, the Hokage announced. Corpse transformation. He knew that there was a good chance Mizuki would be caught, and he took that chance as an opportunity to carry out a new experiment as well as an opportunity to stick it to us. Ibiki added. Burn the body, I do not want any complications. Ibiki agreed and executed a simple Kaiten jutsu which erased any signs that a corpse had ever been there. The third then turned to the mind walker. I shall expect a full report of his memories no later by tomorrow afternoon. After receiving a response in the affirmative, the leader made to return to his home. Just before he could forget, he turned around and gave the final instruction. As always, you do not have the liberty to divulge to anyone what you just witnessed. Any attempts to do so would be met with equal retribution, and with that he was off. The two wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. Not after witnessing how demented and insidious his former student had become. Orochimaru, just how far will you go? The shine of the early daybreak filtered through the blinds, and Ino lazily rubbed away the sleep from her eyes. It was the same dream again. Well, it may as well have been a nightmare, considering how treacherous its premise was. For the past few months she'd been having these dreams that terrified her. In her recurring nightmare, she was stuck in a fire, with no route to exit. Earlier on, the dream had followed and ended with her being saved by the prince of her dreams, Uchiha Sasuke. Though after years of being rejected and ignored by him, recently her dreams had turned more insidious. There was still the fire. She was still in mortal danger. Sasuke was still in the dream. But instead of saving here, he spared a glance at her, turned around to speak to an invisible presence, and said, do whatever you please with her. The girl means nothing to me, and then leaving her alone with the unknown figure. At this point Ino would wake up, and the first few times it had happened she had burst into tears. Now though, she was giving the idea some thought. For years now, she along with many other girls, had done everything in their abilities to get his attention, to no avail. Some of the girls had since stopped their efforts, and someone had even spread the nasty rumor that he had a proclivity for members of his own gender. It was never find out who had done this, and if the culprit had been caught, some very strange and unexplainable things would have been committed by them courtesy of the Shintensen no Jutsu. But it had forced her to confront reality that Sasuke had shown zero interest in her, and after an afternoon discussing the issue with her mother, she had realized to her one-sided devotion was unhealthy for the devotee herself. Turning her attention to her clock, she took note of the time and sighed. The day was the day of team assignments. At the same time, another blonde-haired blue-eyed genin had just returned from his morning exercise. Naruto took off his porcelain mask and set about getting ready for his last day at the academy and the day of team assignments. He had a fair idea of what his team would be, and although he was not particularly religious, Naruto prayed to the big guy upstairs not to give him the team he suspected he would be punished with. For generations now, the team assignments for graduating classes had followed the same three-pronged system. A tracking team, a reconnaissance team or a combat team. And there were further protocols in these teams. 2 Jujutsu wielders could not be in the same unit, the Ino Shikacho trio was to be maintained wherever possible, and one of the 3-man cells consisted of the Rookie of the Year, Kunoichi of the Year, and the last placed student of that graduating batch. And as Naruto knew who all 3 of these individuals were, he was not looking forward to it. One of them was a pseudo-emo consumed with taking the life of his elder brother who disregarded anyone and everyone else as a nuisance, and the other was somehow even worse, a fangirlish banshee obsessed with said emo boy, whose fangirlish tendencies often bordered on outright obsession, and the third, since Naruto had failed the graduation test, would be him. The only person he would not have a personal problem with would be the sensei of this team, Hada Kakashi. He was the only logical choice as out of all the viable candidates, the Haddock was the only with both a Sharingan and decent sealing skills, both abilities which were a minimum qualification for this specific unit. What he would have a problem with was the man's infamous tardiness. Naruto had known the man practically since birth, and although he loved him like an elder brother, he had heard too many stories of the man's unpunctuality when it came to non-shinobi matters. He hoped that this would not extend to his team, otherwise it would make an already difficult situation unbearable. Speaking of the devil, he spotted a small object sticking out of his couch. Concentrating on it, he noticed that it was a bright red bookmark. Sighing, he removed the bookmark out of its hiding place, viewing the scantily clad girls on the bookmark with distaste. Seriously, did adults have no sense? It was a waste of time to read this crap anyway, but to try to coax young teens into this nonsense was juvenile. Okay, you got me, he called out into his apartment. A scarecrow-like figure revealed itself this moment, almost detaching itself from the coat hanger. He dusted himself off and waved his hand. Yo. Naruto facepalmed in reaction. The man before him was the foremost of ninja, surpassed in their village only by the Hokage himself and an elite few others, and he put his tremendous camouflage skills to use by trying to brainwash kids into reading smut. The man mistook Naruto's exasperation as dejection and tried to console him. Oh, don't be sad, Naruto, you're rapidly improving. Last time it took you more than 5 minutes before you realized I was here and you were almost butt naked. Naruto flushed pink. Shut up. Stop trying to sell that porn crap on me, you pervert. The man chuckled as a response. Run from it. Hide from it. Your lust will arise. Any other person would have been creeped out from this, but Naruto was used to such eccentricities from the man since he could remember. Besides, the silver-haired man continued, your conception is the source material for one of these priceless pieces of literature. At this point, the young blonde's entire face had gone tomato red, and to prevent his head blowing up from the information it was receiving, he clamped his hands over his ears to stop his head from blowing up into smithereens. Enough, he hissed, his own voice barely audible to him. The quickly changed subject, he glared fiercely at him. You better not be late, otherwise leaving the sentence unfinished so as to send an ominous message. Kakashi winked with his one visible eye. You better hope so, before saluting him and shining away. Naruto shook his head and went about his daily activities, and after cleaning up was in a bit of a dilemma what to wear. He absolutely loathed the orange eyesore he had worn for the better part of the last 6 years, but it understood its importance in giving him the mask of a dimwit, as he was not yet a shinobi yet and still under the jurisdiction of the civilian council, who were always looking for ways to make his life as difficult as possible. Now though, the headband atop his head officially made him a ninja, and under the Hokage. He much preferred his mission gear, or the black trousers and grey shirt he wore at home. Wearing this to the academy today would certainly raise a few eyebrows today, an occurrence which was already going to happen as he had failed the theory exams. No, it would only increase suspicion, and Naruto had long had the feeling that a few of the more observant students like Shikamaru and Shino had sensed something was amiss. In the end, he went with his usual orange eruption, deciding that, once he was in his 3-man cell, he would do as he liked, as there would be reduced contact with his current classmates. Hanahakagure no Sato Shinobi Academy. Just outside the entrance, Naruto paused, taking one last good look at it. He may not have had many fond memories of this place, but he had learned about the human character in these classrooms by observing students, teachers and even janitors, what motivated them, their goals and fears in life. These things may seem trivial, but he had learned from the stories of his elder brother-like figure just how significant these details could be. After a moment, he walked inside in the direction of his classroom. From the other side, he spotted one Yamanaka Ino walking in his direction. Talk about a headache, he sighed to himself. She too saw him, and she neared him. Naruto could see a frown on her face. What are you doing here? She asked accusatorily. Not even bothering with a reply, he just entered the class and didn't look back even once. Inside, the whole class was abuzz with anticipation, and in the case of the members of the Uchiha Sasuke fan club, nervousness. After all, there was only one Sasuke-kun, and there were so many of them. The chances of any of them being with their beloved were slim. Of these lovely ladies, 2 were currently locked in a race for the most important event of the day, sitting next to Sasuke-kun. Ami was just about to win when her hair braid was yanked backwards and she slipped on the stairs. Outraged, she got up to give her rival a piece of her mind, who was currently sliding up to Sasuke-kun, flashing a smug smile on her ugly mug. What the hell, forehead, that was a cheap shot. She raged. She received a tongue in return. All is fair in love and war, Ami pig. Just as she was about to jump atop her rival and tear a new one, she heard the voice of their instructor. Now everyone, let's settle down. Naruto went towards Iruka-sensei to discuss something, leaving Ino rooted in the same spot. The nerve of that loser. She raged mentally. Who the hell does he think he is to just ignore me like that? Unable to forget the perceived insult, she marched her way towards the fellow blonde, who seemed to be engrossed in conversation with their sensei. I ask you dope, she said out loud, drawing the attention of the entire class now, with the obvious exception of the four creatures at the back including Akamaru, and all of them were pondering the same question she was about to ask, what are you doing here? In response, the idiot sighed in exasperation, as if she were not worth his time. This enraged her even more. To be ignored like she were insignificant deeply insulted her, especially coming from someone like him. As he went to take a seat, she moved her body ahead of him, blocking him off. He looked at her with bemused eyes, like one would at a pet about do something interesting. You didn't answer my question. And? Finally, at least he hadn't lost use of his vocal cords since he failed the exam yesterday. Well, I want an answer. She demanded, with the petulance of a 5-year-old at a candy store. He pointed to the hit I-8 fastened to his forehead as a sufficient answer and moved off, not even looking back at her, to the stares of all his classmates, yes, including the remaining Uchiha. Naruto walked up to his usual spot next to Choji and Shikamaru and right behind Kiba and Akamaru. Almost as if on cue, Choji just finished his bag of chips and turned towards his bag to remove his bag of sweets when he noticed an orange jumpsuit in front of him. He looked up to see Naruto and almost spat out the chips of his mouth. Naruto, I thought. At the mention of the dead last, Kiba turned around sharply. Dumbfounded, he stood up. What the hell are you doing here, dope? Naruto rolled his eyes at the short attention span of the dog Nin and walked past him. This did not go down well with the Inuzuka heir, who lashed out a paw and grabbed Naruto by his elbow. He was about to give the loser a piece of his mind before all the air went out of his lungs. The look on Naruto's face was worse than anything that Kiba had ever seen before, yes, including that one time he had gone to sleep with the tap on and had been woken up with a shoe full to his mouth courtesy of his mother. No, this was almost evil, demonic and a bunch of other fancy terms Kiba didn't know. There was just something totally wrong about the expression on Naruto's face, as if he had wanted Kiba dead. And if he was being honest, at that point in time Kiba wasn't totally sure that Naruto wasn't capable of doing just that. Not realizing Iruka-sensei was calling out to him, Kiba felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He jerked out of whatever had fixed his eyes on Naruto and looked over to see Choji prodding him. Boy, Iruka-sensei has been calling out to you for the last 20 seconds. Where was your focus? Kiba looked down to see Iruka-sensei giving him that classic disappointed parent-teacher look. Kiba quickly removed his arm from the blonde boy and retook his seat. Naruto continued to his spot and settled himself down and unbeknownst to anyone, was struggling to hold in a laugh. Now that was funny. The look on Kiba's face had been priceless. He hadn't intended to frighten the Inuzuka so much, but it was the second time he had been accosted by someone in 5 minutes. Enough was enough. Besides, Kiba was a good friend of his, or as close to a friend he had around his own age. After settling down in his seat, he glanced at the front of the class and saw the Yamanaka girl giving the doe eyes to Iruka-sensei. And for some odd reason, their instructor's eyes scanned over Naruto and gained a conspiratorial quality, which forced Naruto to cross his fingers and hope for the best. Up at the front of the class, Iruka was setting up his desk, making sure he had everyone's papers ready. Once he was finished he looked up, intending to address the class. Instead, he saw the face of young Ino looking up at him almost expectantly. Refraining from frowning, he addressed his student. Why aren't you in your seat, Ino-chan? Because Ami is there. Indeed, Ami was in Ino's seat, right next to Sasuke-kun. Looking around elsewhere to see an empty seat, he spotted something. The spot next to Naruto was empty, or would be if he kept his bag down. Hiding down his professionalism for once, he bit back a grin and looked back to the girl. Well, Ino-chan, there is one empty spot. The girl sighed in relief and followed her sensei's line of vision to the available seat. Her mouth agape in horror, she jerked her neck back and shook her head profusely. Absolutely not, Iruka-sensei, she protested, anywhere but there. Hut hut, Ino-chan. Iruka shook his head. Ino glared back at him in outrage and pointed a finger in his face. You're enjoying this, aren't you? His smile was all the confirmation that she needed to know his answer. Iruka took out a sheet and pretended to read it. Well, you know the rule, Ino-chan. Last one standing is the only one in detention. Ino groaned, finished the proverb for him. And that will be you if you're not where you're supposed to be by the time I finish reading this paper. Accepting defeat, Ino turned around and gazed reluctantly at her seat before begrudgingly moving there. Iruka had to disguise his snort as a cough as he saw Naruto's look of dismay. Looking at the two, he thought to himself they'd make a cute couple before shaking the thought away and getting back to his work. Naruto became increasingly apprehensive as the Yamanaka heir moved closer and closer. He was already going to have an annoying Kunoichi on his team, he had no need for another one. His suspicions were confirmed when she stopped next to him and turned around to face him, hands on her hips. What are you doing here, he said out loud, maintaining his policy of no eye contact. The tick appeared on Ino's forehead, having understood that he was trying to rile her up, and that to her chagrin, it was working. What do you mean, what am I doing here? What are you doing here? This is my spot. It's where I've always sat. I know that, you idiot. I mean, what are you doing in this classroom? You failed the exam. That's none of your business. Now move, you're blocking my path. Who the hell does this guy think he is? Ino protested to herself. There was no way she would give in to the demands of a loser like him. All her carefully built-up social standing would diminish quicker than Choji could get through a bag of chips. Fortunately, she was saved from her dilemma by Choji himself. Don't fret, guys. Naruto will just keep our bags down and you can sit down. Naruto raised an eyebrow. He will. Seeing the imploring look on his friend's face, Naruto desisted and did as ordered. Once this was done, they settled in and listened to Iruka-sensei talk about their responsibilities as shinobi. Groaning him out, Choji turned to Naruto. Hey man, what do you think the teams are going to be? Naruto was about to give a generic confused answer before being rudely interrupted by Ino. Stop talking, Choji, Iruka-sensei is saying something important. Rolling his eyes, Naruto replied, anyway I dunno man, I just hope I don't end up with a Uchiha pricker, that pink-haired harpy. Ino was positively furious now. No one got to say that about Sasuke-kun. And she may be rivals with Forehead, but the hell if she was going to tolerate anyone else insult her. Shut up, you dead last. Don't talk about Sasuke-kun like that. And Forehead either. As consistent with the theme of the day, Naruto ignored her and continued talking to Choji anyway. That was it. This was the last straw. Disregarding every instinct in her body that screamed no. She thrust a hand out and grabbed his orange collar, and then the world turned black. On the other side, Naruto couldn't believe she'd had the nerve to do that. He'd never let anyone do that, and sure as hell not a pompous, self-serving, vain arrogant princess like Ino Yamanaka. Oblivious of her condition, Naruto decided to give her the bright eyes as well. Stop. Naruto froze his head in midair. Narrowing his eyes, he looked toward the giver of the order. What is it, Shikamaru? The pineapple-haired boy gazed at him for a moment, as if pondering how to express himself. You're being troublesome, he finally decided. Both of you. Switch places with Choji. Choji looked in between them, catching up to the tension in the space. Yeah man, let's switch. I'd like to listen what Iruka-sensei has to say too. Naruto chose to listen to them, and soon again, the three of them went back to chattering amongst themselves. As for Ino, she didn't think she could erase what she had just seen. Or heard. Or felt. When she had grabbed his collar, she'd felt this presence. Her mind was too jumbled to be able to coherently acknowledge what she saw. All she felt was this deep-rooted feeling of foreboding, this ominous presence lingering in the background, just waiting for the right moment to strike out and devour her. She had never experienced as much fear as she had then in the moment. Those eyes. Those gigantic eyes. They oozed of malevolence, and yet somehow she doubted it was human. It seemed too menacing and too large for any man. The rest of the world seemed to be passed by her, and she had no way of escaping that hell, unable to escape. And that was what had terrified her. That paralyzed and powerless feeling of the unknown. No matter how much she tried, she didn't think she'd ever be able to rub it out of her skin. Just what are you, Naruto? She whispered to herself. She was glad that Choji was sitting in between them. Anything to be away from that sinister being. When her sensei came, she was all too glad to leave, hoping to never have to experience that again or be this close to Naruto. Time would tell how wrong she was on both those fronts. 3 p.m. Sasuke was annoyed. He'd never felt this way in 3 years, not since he slaughtered his family. After that day, Sasuke had forsaken everything else and consumed himself with one goal, on one path without any deviations. And somehow, someway, someone he did not know and had never even seen, had managed to piss him off. The day Sasuke unlocked the Sharingan, he was going to go after this man as soon as he had finished off the other 5 hours. That's how long he'd been stuck in this room with that insufferable Banshee and that dead last loser. Speaking of the dead last, Sasuke was intrigued to say the least of how different he seemed. And all of this within a day too. Not that he'd ever admit it to anyone, even himself. He saw him still at the end of the class, not having even looked at anything apart from a book he had been reading. Usually he wouldn't pay a second glance if anyone else had done that, but when Naruto was that someone, it certainly raised a few eyebrows. Next to him, the unendurable Haruno Sakura too had a book open on some stupid paper art called origami, which with Sharingan or no Sharingan, Sasuke could clearly see she was pretending to read, having seen her peep at him nervously out of the corner of her eyes every now and then. If that is what his team was going to be like, he'd be best off alone by himself. He didn't have the time for these weaklings to catch up, not when he had a much more important task at hand. He was displaced from his brooding by the jingling of the bell atop the classroom door, signifying that someone was coming through. Sakura was bored. She'd been sitting idly, reading do-it-yourself origami for over 4 hours now. She loved origami, she really did, but there's only so much she could read before boredom set in, and that was what had happened. She'd been secretively glancing at Sasuke-kun every now and then, only he had been staring at the windows each and every time. That only endeared him more in her heart. She liked to think his cold shoulder treatment was just his way of saying that he was well shy. Not once could she remember her Sasuke-kun making crude, illiterate jokes like the other boys. He was always respectful well by being detached as possible. Still, she admired that. Once upon a time, he wasn't as disconnected as he had been since the incident. Back then he was polite, funny even. He had saved her from some bullies once, who incidentally turned out to be his elder cousins, who had been teasing her relentlessly for her bubblegum pink hair. That was amongst Sakura's favorite memories. Speaking of the past, there was another thing bugging her. Her other teammate. Sakura would confess privately that she was never kind to him or knowledgeable of his life, but even she knew that he was quite probably the most thick-headed person in the village. And in the blink of an eye, he had seemingly transformed into this ordinary person, if only a bit solitary. Something was amiss. People didn't just change overnight. Not unless there was a considerable cause or the other more unlikely factor that they had never changed, only hidden their real self. And she couldn't even begin to think why, and more importantly how Naruto was capable of pulling it off. She glanced back to take a close look at him and saw him looking at the door. Following his eyesight, she saw the door slightly ajar and the person who shuffled in could only be described as the most bizarre-looking man she had ever seen. Even Sasuke was at a temporary loss of words. He was of course aware of the secretive nature of shinobis, but the man standing in front of him seemed more like an oddball than a professional killer. Spiky silver hair that defied gravity, a slouch so casual it gave the impression there wasn't a spine supporting it, a mask concealing his lower mouth, and a hit eye slung over his left eye, meaning the only visible part of his face was his right eye and ear. Most damning of all though, was the book the man was engrossed in. Sasuke realized this to be one of those filthy adult comic books that some of his clan members had used once upon a time, and he didn't appreciate the implication that that trash was more important than he was. Sakura seemed to recognize the book too, how he did not know or care to find out, and she too was far from happy being a member of the female species, she clearly did not appreciate the objectification of women. Only Naruto seemed unfazed almost as if he were used to this. That was another new mystery about him, and Sasuke could have sworn Naruto was looking at the man with part admonishment and part admiration. He shouldn't have been. To the best of his knowledge, Naruto was an orphan with no next of kin, his parents having died in the Kyuubi attack with no relatives to take him in. For whatever reason, he was ostracized by most of the village and had no significant relationship in his life. Then who was this person that evoked such a reaction in Naruto, caused him to look at the man as if he were family? And why was Sasuke bothered by it so much? And that was something he didn't like. That Naruto was at the center of his thoughts. Their sensei finally shut his book and looked up at them. My first impression of you is I don't like you. Meet me up on the roof. As soon as he said those words, the man seemingly disappeared into thin air, leaving the faint scent of leaves behind. Sasuke stared at the spot where the man had just stood for a moment before getting up and heading towards for the stairs, not caring to wait for his new teammates. Sakura stared dumbfounded, her eyes the size of golf balls and her mouth elongated like a pufferfish. Was it just a trick of the light, or did that man vanish into thin air? And what was that odor of trees? She would have been rooted to her spot for the rest of the day had she not seen Sasuke move past her to the door. She saw him exit the class, presumably heading for the roof. And in all this time, not once did he look back at her, and that stung. That sting was enough to jolt her out of her astonishment, and she too decided to make for the roof. Taking a cursory look behind to see if Naruto was following her, she saw no one. To her puzzlement, one of the windows was latched open. Resolving that he must have went ahead while she was in a daze, she thought nothing of it and left. Outside the window, Naruto facepalmed. One is too self-centered, and the other too oblivious. Kami, help me. Sasuke grasped the door handle, holding onto it for a moment, hearing the faint tick-tock of Sakura's sandals behind him, and opened the door. A miniature silver comet careened towards him, and it was only due to his heightened senses that was able to dodge in the nick of time. A projectile skimmed past him and struck Sakura's elbow. She staggered back and gave a howl of pain, clutching her arm desperately, struggling to hold back tears as the pain reached unbearable levels. He grabbed his kunai out of its upholstery and cast it back, hoping to strike the belligerent. To his embarrassment, the man from earlier came into view, twirling Sasuke's kunai in one hand, fiddling through the pages of his book with the other. What the hell do you think you're doing? Sasuke glared at the man. He looked up almost in surprise and stored his book away. Oh, so it was you guys. You certainly took your merry time. Sakura struggled in after him, having guessed who it was that had attacked her. Why did you attack us, sensei? His right eye blinked in confusion. Sensei. Why yes, you must mean me. I'm sorry, where are my manners? Please, take a seat, and he shooed them toward the backside of the roof, where Naruto was awaiting them. How did you get up here? Irexit, Naruto answered, cocking his head behind. Of course, Naruto had in truth walked up the wall, but what his teammates didn't know wouldn't hurt them. Sakura made to sit down on one of the ledges, and as her body shifted weight onto the ledge the entire object shook. Tut tut there, sensei shook his head. That's the second time. You know what I do with people who fall for my traps twice. What? Sakura stammered nervously, apprehensive of the punishment she was about to receive. The silver-haired man's mask stretched upwards, signaling he was smiling. I give them a nickname. Oh, Sakura realized, thinking that wasn't so bad, which was her mistake. Taking into consideration your unique physiology, I have made up my mind. From this day forth, you shall be known as Princess Bubblegum. Sakura would have cried injustice if the man hadn't spoken over her. Ignoring her protests, he turned to Sasuke duck hair. Why don't you introduce yourself? Isn't it courtesy to tell someone about yourself before asking them to? And what you want to know about us? Naruto interjected. Fine, the man waved him off before leaning onto the wall. I am Hada Kakashi. I have no intentions of telling you my likes and dislikes. I've never really thought about my future dream. As for my hobbies, I have many. And then looked at Sasuke expectantly. My name is Uchiha Sasuke. I hate a lot of things and I don't particularly like anything. What I have is not a dream because I will make it a reality. I'm going to restore my clan and kill a certain someone. That's pretty intense. Bubblegum, you're next. Well, I'm Haruno Sakura. What I like, I mean, who I like is. She shyly sneaked a look at Sasuke. My hobby is origami. My future dream is another glance at Sasuke, and my dislikes are people who mess about and don't let people be in silence, and this time she took another secretive glance, but in Naruto's direction, who saw and duly ignored her. Take us home, Scarface Kakashi instructed to Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto here. I like instant ramen, but what I like even more is the ramen from Ichiraku. What I dislike is the 3 minutes after pouring hot water in the instant ramen. My hobby is eating and comparing ramen. And my future dream is to find inner peace. Neither Sasuke nor Sakura knew what to make of Naruto's last statement, having never seen this side of him before. And so an uncomfortable silence grew on the group before Kakashi dropped a bomb on them. What if I told you that you aren't genin yet? What? Sakura erupted, and even Sasuke stared blindsided by this revelation. But we passed the academy test, Sensei, Sakura protested. That was just a smokescreen to select the 27 candidates with the best chance of passing. The real test is conducted by the Jonin senseis. Of the 27 candidates, only 9 will be chosen. The other 18 will be sent to the reserves. In other words, these tests have a failure rate of 66%. What are the reserves? Sasuke frowned. All the prospective genin who fail the test to form a unit are sent to the reserve squads. They are Konoha's backup ninjas, so to speak, and actually form the largest part of our workforce. So what test do we have, Kakashi-sensei? Sakura asked. I'm glad you asked, Kakashi. I smiled, and Sasuke could have sworn a dark shadow passed over him. You have a survival exercise. Be sure to bring your complete set of ninja tools. We meet at 5 in the morning. Report to training ground 3. Kakashi got up and whipped out his book, exiting the roof. Just as he was about to open the door, he stopped and turned his head up. And you'd best skip breakfast. Or you're likely to throw up. This threw all of them off track. It had been drilled into them since the first day of the academy that nutrition was a must for shinobis. And Sasuke didn't like the tone in which he had given the order, as if it weren't actually an order, but more a trick question. He looked towards Naruto, who seemed to have reached the same conclusion, but Sasuke had the nagging feeling that his teammate knew more than he was letting on. Sakura was in a dilemma. Yesterday she was a fresh genin, and today she was neither a genin nor an academy student. And the only way to become a genin was to pass a survival exercise for which they had been told not to eat anything beforehand. That didn't make sense to her. How were they supposed to perform on an empty stomach? She turned to her teammates with these conundrums. Hey guys, you don't think Kakashi-sensei really wants us not to eat anything, do you? I don't know, Sakura. Naruto shrugged. The message sounded pretty straightforward to me. It's a trick, Sasuke asserted. It wasn't an order, just a suggestion made to look like an order. He's trying to see if we can think for ourselves. Arigato, Sasuke-kun. How would you like to go dinner? Our first meal as teammates. She turned to her other teammate, not wanting him to feel left out. You should come as well, Naruto. All of us can go together. No, Sasuke declared. We won't be coming to dinner. You can ask someone else. He turned around to see her in the same spot. Leave, he ordered. She didn't need to be told a third time, and as she left she couldn't get rid of the feeling she was being dismissed from something important. Why did you answer for both of us? You knew it was a ruse. Why did you lie? That was something she needed to figure out on her own. If she can't think for herself, then she shouldn't be here. Naruto stepped towards the fire exit to go home. You know him, Sasuke stated. It wasn't a question, but a confirmation. Naruto answered without looking back. What makes you say that? I don't need a Sharingan to figure out when two people know each other, least of all when one of them wears every emotion on his sleeve. Naruto thought of an answer for a moment before settling on. Don't take him lightly. Those porn books are another trick. He's one of the strongest jonins in the village. Oh, and get there before 5, it's an unknown battleground and we need every advantage we can get. Why didn't you say all this to Sakura? She's still a pampered little girl without any knowledge of the real world. At this point she would only be a hindrance. She's not like us. Sasuke narrowed his eyes, and what makes you think we're anything alike? I'll see you around, Uchiha Naruto parried back before exiting down the fire escape. Yes you will use Uzumaki, yes you will. Training Ground 30500 hours. At first glance, Training Ground 3 did not seem like a place for ninja training, but a picturesque snapshot straight out of the calendars her father's company always supplied. And with good reason too. 2 imposing mountains stood like silent sentinels as a gigantic river meandered its way through them, akin to a toddler streaking their way through to their mother. And on either bank were forests filled with lush trees, and the morning smell of sakura flowers blooming wafted its way across to her. And at this time of the day when the sun was waking up, it painted a very ochre color over the entire area. Sakura found it very pretty. There was only blemish on the landscape, or rather a collection of objects. 3 of them appeared to be wooden stumps roughly her size, and the 4th was a giant kunai-shaped structure that shined so bright she could not bear to look at for more than a few moments. She heard the twitch of a branch breaking and, believing it to be a squirrel or rabbit, disregarded it. Just then her teammates walked out of the forest carrying scrolls of paper with strange markings and symbols etched onto them. She almost had to do a double take when she examined her blonde teammate. Gone was the hideous orange monstrosity, replaced by black trousers and a simple black shirt. It made him look very mature, and as he explained something to Sasuke-kun he looked almost happy. She didn't know why, but Sakura liked that look on him. Morning Sasuke-kun, Naruto, she greeted politely. The Uchiha grunted in response while Naruto waved to her. What were you doing in the forest? And what are these scrolls in your hands? Naruto collected the scrolls from Sasuke. These. We were setting some traps and trackers in the forest. If Kakashi-sensei is going to do what I feel, then we need every advantage we can get. And what's that? Sakura questioned him. We'll have to fight him, Sasuke informed her, and maybe even each other. All of a sudden, Sakura didn't feel too good about her chances, and she felt queasy from all the breakfast she'd had this morning. There was no way she could even last a minute against a jonin, and Sasuke-kun was the rookie of the year. Naruto was a blank page. Ever since yesterday, she'd had a difficult time reconciling the Naruto from her memories to this stranger standing in front of her. Then, something struck her. The 2 of them had arrived here, presumably long before her, to scout the area, and neither of them had bothered to ask her to come along. Well, why wasn't I invited? I would have liked to come as well. You're not ready yet, Naruto shrugged, as if it answered every question she'd ever had. Sakura frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Tell me, what was your reaction when you heard Sasuke walking over a fallen branch? I thought it was a rabbit or squirrel. Why? And how do you know that it wasn't a wild animal? Or someone spying on you? Or an enemy from another village? Well, we're inside the village. The chances of that are minimal at best. And that's why you didn't think twice about venturing into a part of the village you've never seen before, that too without any protection. What protection? Sakura asked him. He means weapons, Sasuke explained. Naruto nodded his head. Exactly. Even though there was no need to carry weapons inside the village, as a kunoichi and more importantly a young female, it is always best to be on your guard. We intentionally made that noise to see your reaction. Instead of being alert and moving for a weapon, you relaxed and ignored the possible risk. So do you understand what we mean when we say you're not ready? Sakura nodded dumbly, her brain still stuck processing the fact that Naruto could speak in complex and coherent sentences. Now it's already 5, and we're done setting everything up. It's best to relax and wait for Kakashi-sensei to arrive. After all the walking Sakura had done to find this place, she certainly wasn't opposed to that. There was no way this guy is a genin. Sasuke scowled to himself. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to question his visual prowess. He had probably seen Naruto 5 days a week for 7 years, and none of those experiences had prepared him for the past hour of his life. It had also made it absolutely clear to Sasuke that Naruto was much stronger than he let others believe, and indeed stronger than Sasuke. And by how much? If Sasuke couldn't surpass a no-name orphan like that, how the hell could he catch up to that monster? His Uchiha pride may not want to admit it, but he was a long way from catching up to Naruto. When he had arrived at this ground at 4 AM sharp, Naruto was already waiting for him, dressed in all black wear. While it was a surprise, Sasuke made no comment about it. He was handed a sack full of equipment by Naruto. These are some traps to lay in the forest. It's best if we split up, we can cover more ground faster that way. Finding nothing wrong with the idea, Sasuke nodded and entered one side of the forest. The trees were teeming with life. Once upon a time, Sasuke would have climbed the trees to greet the birds, or petted one of the rabbits, and fed it some carrots. That was all a long time ago. Sometimes, it felt like another lifetime. As Sasuke ventured deeper into the woods, he saw tiny pockets and spaces. Remembering the reason he was here, he thought they'd make excellent cover to set traps and set about doing just that. 20 minutes later, he stepped out to the forest to see once again Naruto waiting for him. "We still have some time, I'd like to go over your traps to make sure there's nothing wrong with them." Sasuke did not like the insinuation that he didn't know how to set traps and that Naruto would be able to correct him. But he decided not to give him a reaction. He merely grunted in response and wordlessly went to Naruto's side of the forest to check on his traps. Half an hour later he walked out of the trees, baffled not to have found a single trap. He saw Naruto sitting atop a branch, silently gazing at the village. The sight of the blonde prankster in that state unsettled him. He was never like this at the academy. "Well, are you just going to sit there or actually plant any traps?" His teammate looked down at him strangely. "What do you mean? I placed at least a dozen. And speaking of traps, I found yours. I must say, they're not half bad." "Where are these traps you're speaking of?" "You're standing right next to one." "What?" Sasuke turned stiff at that moment, apprehensive of accidentally activating the trap. Naruto jumped down from the branch right in that bush of trees. A human-sized mouse trap. He looked for the trap and came up empty-handed. "I can't see it." "Of course you can't, it's camouflaged." Sasuke had a perplexed expression on his face in response and Naruto's eyes twinkled. "I know someone. Anyways, come with me. I'll show you all the rest." The next 5 minutes were the most inexplicable 5 minutes of Sasuke's life. Naruto proceeded to point out the hiding place of each and every trap he had set, along with the rationale of that particular trap. This included its design, mechanism and function. Forget Naruto, Sasuke had never heard so many high-end words out of the mouth of any person, and if he were a normal person, his eyes would have popped out their sockets and his teeth fallen off his gums. Alas, as he had a reputation to maintain, all he could muster up was an alarmed appearance. "Hey, look over there." Naruto nodded to Sasuke's back, where a pink-haired speck was becoming more and more visible. Speaking of an alarm, he sighed to himself. He had nothing against the girl, truly nothing. And had his life not turned out the way it had, he could have been more receptive to her advances. But that was not the reality. He hoped she pulled herself up, if not for herself then for the sake of this team, which Sasuke already did not see a viable future for. A sensei who seemed to have major smut addiction, an orphan with more unknowns than the great sage himself, and a book-smart know-it-all with little use in the field. And he was expected to get along with these people, let alone form a successful unit. How in the world was he supposed to get stronger? He was disturbed from his brooding again by his stranger of a teammate. "Play along with me. When she gets close enough, break one of these branches. I want to see her reaction." And with that he disappeared into the branches, as if he were never her in the first place. Why Naruto wanted to see her reaction he did not know, and why he chose to follow him, that too he did not know. And now it was 4:55 and Naruto was reading the same book yesterday. Sitting right in front of him with the book almost touching his nose, Sasuke read the tale of the utterly gutsy shinobi written in bold on the cover. Sakura voiced out his question. "What book are you reading, Naruto?" "Oh, it's about a shinobi who travels across the world and never gives up on his hope of achieving peace." It was at that point that Sasuke tuned out their drabble, scoffing to himself at the very notion of a thing as peace. Clearly whatever fool had written that was a mundane civilian with no knowledge of the horrors of the shinobi world. Sasuke's father had once told him that the word shinobi actually meant to kill. "I just made that up, so please don't come at me, any Japanese speakers." Their very title was that of a murderer, and for Naruto to read that, well, Sasuke was oddly disappointed in him. He had thought that from his display of skill earlier today, he would know better than to believe nonsense like that. Sasuke's head shot up when Naruto informed Sakura the writer of the book the author is actually my godfather. Sakura too was clearly at a loss of words, having believed along with everyone else that Naruto had no one to provide for him. "Who?" Sasuke asked almost as an interrogation. "Oh, he's an old man. Mostly retired now, just goes around from place to place writing books." "What kind of books?" Sakura chimed in. "Oh, you probably haven't read them. Anyway, it's 5 a.m. I wonder where Kakashi-sensei is." As if on cue, their sensei emerged out of thin air and greeted them. "Yo. There he is." Naruto clapped them both on the back and both of them felt a sting which they brushed aside as a firm hand. "You're early today," Sakura pointed out. "Really?" Their instructor scratched his head. "I thought I was right on time. Considering that you were over 5 hours late the last time, I'd say arriving on time is early for you." She berated him. He sheepishly shrugged his neck for a minute before straightening up. "Alright, now that we're all here we can begin. First things first, did any of you have some breakfast?" "Yes," the three of them chorused. Kakashi seemed cross with them. "I thought I told you not to eat anything beforehand. Then why did you disobey me?" Sasuke looked up at him. "We didn't disobey you. You had never ordered us not to eat anything beforehand. It was a suggestion. And you chose to ignore it." "Yes," Sakura admitted. "And what makes you think you know more about being a shinobi than I do?" "Our education," Naruto supplied. Sakura looked at him incredulously, no doubt remembering all the times Naruto spent out of the class rather than inside. Kakashi seemed to loom over them threateningly, as if he were considering punishment before leaning back and giving them an eye smile. "You're all correct. As a shinobi, you should be able to sort out what is necessary for the success of your mission and what isn't. In this case, if you were to show up with empty stomachs for a survival mission, well, let's just say there wouldn't be much survival." "What exactly is our survival, Kakashi-sensei?" Sakura asked, evidently disheartened by their sensei's ominous words. These Kakashi removed a pair of bells from his utility belt. "Your aim is to take these bells from me and evade me until noon within the confines of this training ground. Failure to do so will result in your demotion to the reserves." "But there's 3 of us," Naruto pointed out. "Correct, and only the 2 people to take these bells from me will pass. The one who fails to do so will not only be sent to the reserves, but also tied to one of those stumps," he pointed in their direction, "and have their nails removed." "What?" all 3 of them yelled. Sakura pointed at him. "I refuse to take the test then." "Suit yourself," Kakashi shrugged, "and know that doing so would invalidate you from pursuing any shinobi qualifications in every shinobi village." Seeing the look of apprehension on his charges, Kakashi whipped out his orange book of love and began perusing it. Peeking up to see they were still all in the same place, he called out, "And your time starts." Before he could say no, all 3 vanished into the surroundings. "At least they know how to hide," Kakashi chuckled internally. What the hell was Kakashi thinking? The Konoha shinobi are never supposed to hurt, maim or torture their fellow nin. Not unless they had turned rogue, which certainly was not the case here. As many faults as Naruto could point out in his teammates, that did not mean in any way he was willing to torture them. And what was this nonsense about one of them being failed and shipped to the reserve squads? There's never been a 2-man genin unit, so what was he playing at? Unless it was all a trick. Since he had known him, Kakashi had always drilled one thing into Naruto's mind. Look underneath the underneath. Naruto stopped panicking for a moment and cleared his head. Closing his eyes and using his gift of chakra perception, he determined where his teammates and sensei were. Not that he needed to. Kakashi's head stood out like a cow in a slaughterhouse, and he had bugged the other 2 when he had touched them on the shoulder. It was just good not to let his abilities rust. Through his chakra perception, he could see his new sensei gushing and fawning at the contents of that book, an ingenious ruse that masked his actual vigilance and monitoring of the situation. His teammates were on either side of him, Sakura lying flat on a tree branch that, obscured as it was, only made her pink hair stand out even more. Sasuke, too, was in an unfavorable position lurking in the bushes right behind Kakashi. Seriously, did neither of them realize how strong a jounin was? Having made a mental note of the environment, Naruto shifted his focus to their supposed task. It was obvious to both him and Kakashi, and he suspected Sasuke as well after this morning, that Sakura had no chance of getting anywhere near those bells. Which meant Sakura would have to join the reserves. Meaning that there would be no Team 7. Wait a minute. As Naruto's mental gears turned and he realized the true purpose of this test. "Oh Kakashi, you sly fox, where is he? I thought he was there a moment ago." Deciding that it was safe to come down, Sakura ventured her way down the relatively low branch. Dusting herself as she touched the floor, she looked around her, remembering this morning's advice from her teammates. That still seemed untrue to her. She had not gotten much sleep last night, pondering just what had transpired after she was pretty much told to get lost. She had never seen her 2 teammates say a word to each other, much less make decent conversation. And although she couldn't describe why, she could feel some tension between them, which usually would not have surprised her considering the difference in their status, but this somehow felt more personal. Seeing no signs of the silver-haired man, she cautiously moved forwards, attempting to maintain her anonymity for as long as possible. All efforts at remaining unforeseen were shattered, however, when she turned around and saw Sasuke-kun. She screamed, moving as quick as her small feminine legs could propel her to his downed and bloodied form. Great. She probably got hit by a genjutsu. What a pathetic waste. But what that with Kakashi was projecting a genjutsu, it was the opportune time to strike and get one of those bells. Perhaps she had some use after all. To his chagrin though, someone else seemed to have come to the same realization. And before he had. He shrunk back into the bushes, watching with keen eyes as his sensei and other teammate faced each other off. Naruto raced out just as Sakura's scream echoed across the training ground, sending any wildlife in the area fleeing for their lives. He had already sent a clone to Sasuke to try and convince him, not that he was too optimistic of his chances. "I'm disappointed in you," Kakashi frowned, still flipping pages. "Don't be," Naruto stated. "I've sent a clone over to him, hopefully he'll be agreeable." "And if he won't?" Kakashi questioned. "Then we all go head to the reserves." "I didn't know you'd be willing to do that for them." "Of course I wouldn't. That's why I'm going to make sure it doesn't get to that stage." "Very well." Kakashi closed his book and stored it away. What shall we do until then to pass the time? Oh, I can think of a few things. Naruto grinned before charging at his sensei. All he could see were two blurs zooming past each other and occasionally coming into contact before zooming away. With each passing second, Sasuke grew more and more enraged at himself, at Naruto, at that monster. And then all of a sudden, as if out of nowhere they slowed down. Not to slow motion, but to a perceptible pace. They were still just fighting with their bare hands, not using any weapons or jutsus. Naruto kept on attacking the elder man from all sorts of angles, with each and every part of his anatomy. Kakashi on his part was barely evading his attacks, but it was quite evident that he was making no attempt to attack or that he was under any sort of strain, content with dodging at the last second. What Sasuke did not realize was that, for the second time in his life, his eyes had turned red blood red. Unfortunately for Sasuke though, the crimson red sphere in his eye disappeared just as abruptly as it had appeared. His scrutiny of their tussle was terminated by a whisper behind him. "Hey Sasuke." He breathed before a hand clamped over his mouth. "SSSH." The boy's face came into view and his eyes narrowed in disbelief. He pushed their arm off his mouth and turned fully to face them. "How are you here? Who's that fighting with Kakashi?" "Relax. I'm just a clone, that's the original Naruto." "What? But you're not an illusion." "Of course I'm not. I'm a shadow clone." "Since when did the dope make shadow clones?" Sasuke hissed. "You'd be surprised at our abilities." He looked at the duplicate expectantly, hoping that there was a good reason he had bothered him and potentially exposed his location to Kakashi. The clone seemed to suddenly realize it was here for a purpose and shook its head before looking at him seriously. "I know how we can pass this test." "Of course you do. Kakashi told us. We have to get the bells from him." "No, we don't. There's only 2 bells. If one person fails, we all fail." "What are you talking about, idiot?" The clone held his hands up to placate him. "Just hear me out. Genin are always in 3-man units with a jounin. So how, if one of us fails, can the other 2 for a 3-man unit? It makes no sense. Then why would Kakashi give us this test? Think about it yourself. When you first saw him, you probably thought he was a good-for-nothing pervert. Not 2 minutes later, he almost took your head off with a door key of all things." "What door key?" "That's not the point. I'm trying to say, the man is full of tricks. I told you this yesterday and I'm telling you again, he's tricking us." Sasuke deliberated on his words. It did seem true, he had never seen a 2-genin squad. And from yesterday it was quite clear that their sensei was nothing like he seemed at first glance. Being an Uchiha though, and a prideful one at that, his ego just could not let go of what he had just seen. He too wanted to be tested against the very best and do better than the blonde had. Looking back at the clone, he asked one last question to him, something he had realized at that very moment. "How did you find me?" "Easy," the clone shrugged. "I bugged you when I clapped you on the shoulder." Here the clone picked it off his left shoulder and indeed a minuscule, barely visible black spot was in his hands. This only served to further provoke the boy's rage and he swiped at the clone, letting the device fall to the ground. Against his better judgment, he stomped his foot onto it, smashing it into pieces before pouncing out of his hiding spot. Naruto fell back a considerable distance, the early signs of fatigue starting to develop. It had been a while since he'd sparred with Kakashi and he was glad for it. The spars served not just as physical exercise, but as a psychological notice: don't get too cocky, you still have a long way to go. Besides, they'd just given Sasuke a show and Naruto was eager to see how the black-haired boy would respond. He wordlessly fell back and lo behold. Within seconds Sasuke took his place, a mask of rage etched onto his face. If only he had some popcorn. Sasuke dashed to Kakashi without preamble, his usual tactical awareness shoved aside by his pride and fury as he lunged wildly at the man. Kakashi did not even have to look up, simply ducking underneath the boy's flying foot as he sailed past him and wildly landed behind. Sasuke hurled a series of shuriken in response, getting more riled up by the man's comments. This forced Kakashi to bring up a kunai of his own, blocking all the weapons with expert ease. "Whatever happened to the Rookie of the Year?" Kakashi questioned, almost innocently. "Stop talking," he snarled as he performed a series of hand seals which almost caused Kakashi to panic. "Pain." Pankakik no Jutsu, a giant ball of fire escaped from his mouth and struck Kakashi, giving Sasuke an eerie chill in his chest. When the smoke cleared, it was Sasuke's turn to panic. Instead of a burned sensei, he saw nothing. His eyes scanned the direction Kakashi could have gone. North, east, south, west, up, under. A voice shot out from underneath him, accompanied by an arm that latched onto his left foot and dragged him through the topsoil until only his head was left above ground. Kakashi ducked down to Sasuke's eye level. "Seems like the mighty Uchiha clan isn't so mighty after all," he mumbled, not quite to himself. Sasuke tried his best to free his arms and free himself so as to get back at his tormentor. Seeing his struggle, Kakashi produced some duct tape and applied it over his charge's mouth and disappeared into the forest, affording himself some quality reading time. Out of the bushes, Naruto struggled to contain a snigger at watching Sasuke's plight. Sakura wanted to die. No, not as a metaphorical statement, but as a fact. At least hell would be less horrifying than this. After stumbling upon Sasuke-kun's desecrated body, she tried her very best to resuscitate him, going so far as to repeatedly bang her fists on his chest. After that had failed, she tried to run to the hospital, or the Hokage's office, or even the academy, just so she could get out of this godforsaken forest. To her dread, she kept reaching the same place, the final resting site of her Sasuke-kun, and each time more bodies piled up. First her parents, then her family, her friends, Iruka-sensei, the Hokage, Kakashi-sensei and finally Naruto. After the final corpse showed up, she had resorted to unevenly walking around, hoping that Kakashi-sensei broke her out of the Jinjutsu. Her wish was granted, though in the most inopportune manner. She felt a sharp gust of wind graze her back, and she instinctually jerked forwards and looked behind. In front of her was the head of one Uchiha Sasuke, his mouth covered by duct tape as he toiled to come out. The sight was a sensory overload for her, and she promptly passed out from the stress on her brain. When she woke up, she was aching all over her body. She tried to move, only to experience a painful pressure around her arms and sternum. Blinking out the dark spots from her eyes, she sees Sasuke-kun and Naruto in front of her with kunais in their hands and an unreadable expression on their faces. 30 minutes earlier, he found that the comic nature of the scene had given way to a sense of languor. Watching the last reminder of a once proud and mighty clan reduced to clawing and scratching his way out of some soil whilst mute had soon lost its joy. And there was still the pressing issue of passing the test. He didn't have any interest in teaming up with those two, but he'd be damned if he let the old man down. That had been one of the Sandame's rare requests to him. To try and get along with people. He knew he could be a shinobi working on his own, but he wanted to honor his grandfather's wish and try to succeed this way. Not to mention, it would be pretty cool to have Kakashi as his sensei. With that in mind, he approached the boy again, this time by himself. Another clone? Sasuke asked him. Naruto shook his head, it's the real deal this time. Sasuke turned his head away in dismissal, apparently content with being stuck in the ground. Suit yourself then, Naruto shrugged, walking away. Wait, a voice halted him. Naruto turned around, cocking his eyebrow in interest. He help me, Sasuke demanded. Naruto maintained the same facial expression, and Sasuke grunted in frustration as he realized what Naruto was waiting for. Please. Attaboy. Naruto helped him burrow his way out of the hole and helped him over to rest against a tree. We can't beat him, Sasuke admitted. Of course we can't. But we're not supposed to. Then how can we pass? Naruto looked Sasuke directly in the eye this time by showing him that we can work together. That's the whole point of a teamwork. We don't have to get the bells we probably want. We just have to prove that we can work together. And how did you figure that out? Sasuke asked, not breaking eye contact. When you were busy brooding at the windows at Uchiha-sama, I was actually paying attention in school. Sasuke snorted. I didn't know you made jokes. I didn't know you could recognize a joke. Well, are you just going to stand there or give me a hand? Naruto brought his hand forward. I thought you'd never ask. Kakashi was at the climax of both the book and the characters. I hope you get the joke. He practically lived for this part of the book. All the hero's efforts culminating in the award of a life, a passionate act of love which brought out every positive emotion in the human mind. He giggled as he flipped through the pages, blood slowly dripping out of his nostrils. Of course, the joy didn't last long. He heard a slight rustling in the leaves and followed the sound with his eyes. From behind, a black-clad figure rushed at him. He met his attacker this time, dodging his outstretched fist and striking him in the solar plexus. Sasuke gasped before bursting into smoke. Since when could he make shadow clones? In his confusion, he forgot to keep track of the noise. He returned his book to his satchel and picked out a kunai. After a moment's silence, a dozen Sasukes charged him, encircling him. He was forced to evade all of them, and as he moved around a particular set of trees, he failed to notice the trap in between. As he landed on the ground, a metallic clasp blocked over his foot, stopping him from going anywhere. One of the clones, possibly the original, went through a series of hand seals which he recognized. Ton. Tatapa. A gust of wind shot at him, and he desperately sought to extricate himself. After the smoke from the attack had cleared, all that was visible was a log of wood. Kakashi was looking down at the scene as all the clones dispersed one by one. It took him a moment to realize the trickery at hand, and he couldn't help but smiling at his student's handiwork. Don't move, a voice came from behind him. A kunai came to his throat. Kakashi sighed, disappointed that he had to stop playing games. He dispersed himself, almost causing his assailant to fall off in surprise. That bastard, Naruto grinded his teeth, he knew the entire time. That was fun. Naruto's head shot up and he saw Kakashi in the branch above him, lazily reading that trash. Is this the actual you? I could ask you the same, his tutor parried back. How did you know that was me? There's a handful of wind users in the entire village and Sasuke certainly isn't one of them. And how did you escape my trap? Well, you'll just have to catch me to find out. And with that, he too burst into smoke, revealing himself as another clone. Naruto gritted his teeth in frustration at being bamboozled repeatedly. Resigning to their failure, he decided to regroup with Sasuke. He moved down using the branches, taking care not to reveal his tree-walking ability to Sasuke. They may have shared a joke, but it was a long way before he could trust Sasuke with something like that. He had already laid some hints, trying to see how Sasuke would react, and his hostile response was not at all encouraging. What happened up there, Sasuke asked, noticing the displeased look on his face. It didn't work, as we had expected. Then why are you so pissed off? I had hoped to leave with some dignity. Forget it, we'll have to find some other way of getting him. At the very least, I want to burn that book of his. Sasuke narrowed his eyes at that statement. How much would you say he likes those books? Whenever I've seen him, he's always carried that around with him, Naruto revealed. Sasuke's eyes shined for a moment and Naruto felt a tingle across his spine as he revealed his plan. The original Kakashi was back to where they had started. He thought about reviving Sakura but decided to wait and see what the boys would do about her. Seeing no one around, he whipped out Icha Icha again and became engrossed in it. Once again, his male students attempted to surprise him and he merely shifted his hips to the left to avoid contact. To his surprise, just as he moved left, Naruto's hand shot upwards, away from his hips and toward his hand. Kakashi watched in horror as his beloved was snatched from him. "Give it back," he wailed. "Don't come forward," Naruto warned as Sasuke took out a shuriken and moved it towards the book. What are you doing?" Kakashi looked on in terror as Sasuke bent closer and closer to his target. "Saint, stop," Kakashi begged. The bells for the book Naruto offered him and he sweetened the deal by holding the book by its ends and applying some force. Kakashi threw the bells at them and rushed to collect his book. Naruto moved it out of grip just as he was about to rescue them. "Not yet," he reprimanded Kakashi. Sasuke checked to make sure they really were the bells and when he nodded in confirmation, Naruto let go of the book. Just as it was about to come into contact with the ground, Kakashi leaped and fell atop it, clutching it akin to a mother her babe. If that wasn't creepy enough, Kakashi's mask was slightly moist, indicating tears. How pathetic, Naruto thought to himself. "So do we pass then?" Sasuke asked, twirling the bells around in his hand. "In a manner of speaking, yes. But," Naruto probed, "but not as a team. Having tested Sakura, I could see why you did include her in this plan. But, I would have liked to have seen her involved." "Well, she was whammied by you now, wasn't she?" Naruto countered. "And both of you knew how to break her out of it. Yet you chose not to. That's not good teamwork." "So you're actually saying that we failed?" Sasuke guessed. "Under ordinary circumstances, yes. However, I was impressed by your unorthodox approach. So I'll give you another chance. Here's what you have to do now." Sakura didn't like the look on their faces. And where was Kakashi-sensei? Naruto moved closer to her, still grasping his weapon. A pair of hands gripped her by the shoulders. "Sakura, you have failed your mission." She recognized the voice. "Kakashi-sensei. What are you doing?" His voice boomed at her. "You failed. You know the consequence of that. But since I'm merciful, I'll give you one more chance to pass." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. To pass, you must let your teammates cut off your hair." "What?" Sakura screamed. "Let me finish. If you refuse, not only you, but your teammates will also fail. And they won't be allowed to take this test again." Both boys looked at her pointedly and she could see from the look in their eyes just what they thought of that. On cue, they both moved towards her. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Their outstretched hands edged towards her and in her mind she was begging and screaming at them to stop. Externally, she couldn't make a sound. It was as if her throat had closed up, denying her the chance to object. As Naruto gripped her locks firmly in his hand, Sakura closed her eyes and accepted her fate. She whispered almost imperceptibly to herself for the team and awaited the inevitable. Instead, she felt the force on her arms being loosened and when she opened her eyes, she was able to move her limbs. Looking at her hands, she could see bands of red bruising where the rope had been applied and she slowly felt the sensation of blood traveling into her arms and stomach. Sakura looked up at Kakashi-sensei in confusion. "I thought." He shook his head. "You didn't think I would actually do that, did you? Or that your teammates would?" She blushed in response, feeling embarrassed in herself. "But why did you threaten to?" "That was the true motive of this test. Teamwork." "I don't understand. When I told you your hair had to be cut off or all of you would fail, you initially resisted. But you eventually came to terms with it and accepted that it was in the best interests of your team. In other words, you sacrificed for your team. That's what being a team is all about. So you weren't really going to?" "Of course not. As a member of the long hair corps, I would never mess with anyone's hair. But you were willing to, showing to me that you have what it takes to be a productive member of our team. Sakura then shifted her attention to her new teammates, and what about Sasuke and Naruto, how do they pass? I mean, I was the one about to give up my hair. We already passed, Naruto informed her. Well, you were knocked out. How? Sakura probed. Tell you what. Since it's our first day as a team, I'll take you all out today. You can tell each other everything you want to, Kakashi proposed. Cool, she jumped up, happy to spend the entire day with Sasuke, and Naruto seemed pretty interesting to her as well now. The boys nodded, and soon they headed off for the first of their numerous team bonding exercises. Later that night, burning houses, devastated cities, sobbing mothers, inconsolable children. One after another, images of horrible and twisted scenarios flashed through his mind like a maelstrom tearing across the ocean, attacking his sanity with each gruesome graphic. He broke free from the cruelty and found himself awake and gasping, clutching at his sweat-wetted sheets. Naruto grasped his hair and rubbed his eyes, desperately trying to get rid of the images he'd just seen. What do you want? A deep, inhuman voice replied. What makes you think you have anything I want? Then why are you doing this? I thought we had an agreement. You make it sound like we're equals. I decided on my own volition not to squander my time tormenting your pathetic existence. Then what was this for? Naruto received no answer. He tore at his sheets, the sound of the threads being ripped apart doing little to soothe his aggravation. He had no idea why the tailed beast would decide to do this after all this time. As a boy, it had been exceedingly dangerous for him to sleep. The fox would torment him with barbaric images of human suffering, most likely brought on by its own maliciousness. Naruto would be thrashing around in his sleep, begging and screaming at the beast for mercy, to get out of his mind and leave him alone. Those were the days he really bonded with Kakashi. He suspected that he was thought of as a responsibility by the man prior to that incident, nothing more than an obligation to his sensei and teammates. Not be spoken with, only to be observed. He could remember the moment their relationship changed like the lines on the back of his hand. Naruto had just gone through another nightmare dealt by the tanuki residing within him. His fragile mind could not bear the weight of the horrors he had just seen, and he clutched his head in his hands and began crying softly. The next thing he knew, he felt an arm draped over his shoulder. Go away. In that moment, he wanted to be by himself. Or with his grandfather. And definitely not with this strange-looking man who would spy on him every now and then. In response, the man enveloped him further within himself so that Naruto was in his arms, his head lying on the strange-looking man's chest. Naruto gave in and cuddled closer, letting the man take care of him. No words were spoken. No grand proclamations of being family or brothers were uttered. Yet, Naruto gained peace in that silence. I hope that wasn't too corny. In those moments, a quite intimate understanding was established between the two, an unspoken pact of brotherhood. The next morning, Naruto woke to a strange sensation in his hand. He looked down and saw a cool shiny metal object enfolded within his palm, with a note accompanying it. Whenever you want to find me, just think of me and I'll be there. Some days later he met the man again, in his grandfather's office of all places. There, the two adults had a long chat with him about a lot of things like why there was a giant fox in his head, why he was the only one not to have parents, or what his responsibilities were. And it wasn't much later that he was introduced to his godfather, who was his own bag of delights. And Naruto did not regret it one bit. Even during the turbulent times, like when Kakashi or Jiraiya would be out of the village doing missions they could not tell him about, or especially when any of them acted like perverts. At the end of the day though, they were still a family. No matter how dysfunctional or unconventional, they were his family. And he would not have it another way. He looked at his bedside table, where the first gift he ever received was housed in a case. Of course, now he knew it was one of his father's specialized kunai for his flying thunder god technique, and though of not used to him in the battlefield yet, he still preserved it as a reminder of his loneliness, of the dark path he could have been on were it not for a geezer, a hermit and a copycat. Getting out of bed, he changed his sheets and clothes. There was no way he could get sleep now, not after what his mind had just been exposed to. In his condition there was only one thing left to do: train. Not just physically, but mentally. The self-satisfaction after pushing himself to his utmost limits was beyond comparison. Except to the feeling of a belly well fed and stuffed with Ichiraku ramen. Training Ground 7. For some reason, Naruto felt both safe and exposed in this part of the village at night. Being within the village borders, it was of course well guarded. The danger was presented by the people doing the guarding. In the aftermath of the Kyuubi's disastrous attack, there was a vacuum of power. Not just by the obvious death of a sitting Kage, but by the loss of innumerable shinobi. Most of these were high-ranking officials, and many had important security jobs. Trying to replace these individuals with a depleted pool from which to choose would have been immensely difficult, until Shimura Danzo stepped in. The old man had once explained to him the resourcefulness and importance of the man. It had always struck him as being quite convenient. When the village was depleted of able shinobi, here steps in a wizened veteran to provide for his motherland's security and secure its future. Sometimes, it struck him as too convenient. As if the cripple had waited for this to happen and maybe even wanted it. But why? For a man so seemingly obsessed for the welfare of his village and people, why would he deliberately sabotage the village's defense? In some mystifying manner, the elder brought in hundreds of new shinobi, all seemingly foreign citizens he had carefully and secretly honed over the years as a backup reserve in the event of a calamity, like the one which had occurred. To this date, the origin or names of any of these shinobi was still undisclosed, and Saratobi's numerous attempts at an official enquiry into these mysterious forces never came to fruition. For better or worse, these strangers were here to stay. These men and women were tasked with the nighttime guardianship of Konoha, though Naruto suspected their actual work was far more diabolical. In essence, these people had free reign over the village at night, free to do as they please. Which included spying on its citizens and reporting back to their liege, the only person in the village they owed any sort of debt or loyalty to. Moving towards the center of the field, he closed his eyes and concentrated. All the background disturbances faded away. All that was perceptible was himself and the presence of chakra around him. In the trees, in the leaves, even in the bees. But especially in the humans. He zoned in on them, only to find a similar chakra signature on each of them. In fact, the resemblance was like for like. And that should not have been possible. Even twins had some differences, hell even shadow clones did. After all, they were the result of a person's chakra being split into half, and no portion of a person's chakra was the same as another. This was yet another conundrum about these people that he could not answer. And the thing was, why? Why go to all these lengths to hide these people? And from whom? From the very village they were protecting. He sighed. People confused him. Well, almost all of them. Some were quite easy to read. His teammates, for example. Sasuke was nothing more than an avenger, a slave to his own lust for power, who would stop at absolutely nothing to obtain the power he so desperately needed to the man who slaughtered his clan. Talk about brotherly rivalry. And Sakura. He tried not to look down upon so badly. After all, her misgivings weren't so severe. Sure, she was bewitched by their teammate to the point of mania, but Naruto had found that she was quite not so bad during their dinner last night, as long as her attention was not breached by her precious Sasuke-kun. Naruto looked around, sensing the lone person apart from him in this forest. He thought about approaching him, but decided against it. It was too risky, there were too many unknowns, and he had no backup. Even with his heightened senses courtesy of the Kyuubi, he could neither see nor smell this person. It was almost as if they were not even there, almost. Letting the person be, as there was no obvious proof of any ill activity, he turned around and started warming up, the hidden person going into the back of his mind. The unknown person meanwhile, from their vantage point, continued sketching a likeness of the boy. The next morning, if I see that wicked beast one more time, I swear I'm going to stick a shuriken up where it won't shine, Naruto grumbled. Team 7 had just finished the rescue Tora mission for the 5th consecutive time that day and had dropped off the cat to its owner's residence, who was the wife of the fire daimyo. After having exhausted a boatload of chakra for shadow clones to capture the little rascal, Naruto was beginning to suspect the little monster was the descendant of a Bakaneko, translates into changed cat. A Bakaneko is an evil yokai, a supernatural creature. For once, I agree with you, Sasuke admitted. Even Sakura was tired of the same mission over and over again, and she requested their sensei for a change. Is there not any other mission we can do? She pleaded. Well, usually this particular mission takes up an entire day to complete, but since Naruto can pretty much spam the Kage Bunshin, I don't see why not. We can see what other mission postings are available. They entered the Hokage Tower and went to the missions room. Inside, Iruka was sorting out completed mission reports from incomplete ones. Now I remember why I left active duty, he muttered to himself. The Iruka-sensei, Naruto greeted, striking the bell on his table, catching the man off guard and almost sending him falling back. Iruka sorted himself out and upon seeing Kakashi's team struggling to hold back laughter irked out. What are you here for? He snapped, the size of his head growing bigger and bigger. Knowing what was about to come next, Sakura quickly handed over the mission report to him, hoping to avoid another one of his infamous big head jutsus. It worked almost instantaneously. Iruka's head shrunk down to normal size and after a quick perusal of the document, he smiled. Congratulations, Team 7. That was the quickest rescue Tora mission in village history. Even the Sannin didn't accomplish this feat so quickly. Sakura gushed with pride at this, and even Sasuke was satisfied to hear this. Only Naruto still remained ticked off. In fact, Iruka continued, rifling through papers before procuring one. Not too short after you returned Tora to the daimyo's wife, her pet eagle flew in with a note. Let me guess, Tora escaped again, Sakura guessed. Indeed, Iruka nodded, pleased at his former student's deduction. Kakashi intervened at this point, not liking the dangerous shade of red Naruto's face had become at the mention of the cat. I'm afraid we'll pass on that one, Iruka. But, is there something else? He asked. Well, Iruka stated, going through the pages for a mission request. Kakashi saw the state of mess on Iruka's table and grabbed hold of a random paper, which turned out to a mission request. Giving it a quick scan, he turned to Iruka. How about this? He said, holding the paper in front of him. That was already allocated to another genin team, Kakashi, Iruka stated. Taking a pen out of the pen box, Kakashi shrugged, I'm sure they'll appreciate the extra help, and signed his name next to the previous signatory. What's the mission, sensei? Sakura asked. There's been reports of robberies in the village market, leading them out of the building. He expanded, shop owners closing their stores at night and returning the next morning to find the whole place looted. And our job is to investigate the crime scene for any clues and survey the area until nightfall. And afterward, Sasuke pressed. We will be replaced by an experienced Chunin squad and then return and hand over our mission report. Seeing the disappointed look on the boys' faces, Kakashi gave them a stern look. Strong as you both may be, you're still officially genin, not even a week into the job. D ranks is all you'll be doing for the rest of the month. Konoha Market, this is troublesome, he muttered, to nobody in particular. If he had known that shinobi life was going to be like this, he never would have gotten up from under the tree outside his house on the first day of school. Now that wasn't quite so troublesome. Shikamaru could spend the rest of his days cloud gazing. After all, it didn't require much effort and it was pretty entertaining if he was honest. Lying on the soft grass, detaching himself from any worldly concerns and becoming one with nature. The sound of the crickets, the humming of the birds and the assortment of clouds of unique shape and size telling their own stories, it was quite intoxicating at times. If only his mother didn't nag him so much. Speaking of nagging, he could hear Ino in the back of his mind going off about not paying attention and whatnot, and he tuned her out as he rested his head back and analyzed the shape of the clouds. He quietly did just that until his other teammate interrupted him. Hey, who's that? Choji asked with a mouthful of dango. That's Sasuke in forehead, who else? Ino answered. Of course I recognize those two. I mean the people behind and next to them. Choji pointed at them, look, the blonde and the gray hair guy. With great reluctance, he tore his eyes away from the skies to where his teammate was gesturing. Indeed, Sasuke and Sakura were there and they appeared to be getting bigger. As were the two people along with them. Shikamaru's cloud examinations had gifted him with a keen eyesight and he narrowed in first at the person next to them. That's Naruto, he called aloud. Don't be ridiculous, Ino scoffed. There's no way Naruto would ever quit that horrible orange miscarriage of fashion. There seemed to be a hint of animosity in her tone, and he wondered if she still felt some dislike from that last interaction at the academy. Speaking of that, it seemed neither had Naruto. As they closed in, he could see a clear scowl etched on his face, making him look eerily like a fox. No, that is Naruto, Choji corroborated, though judging by his face he too was confused. He seems quite different there, sensei spoke, pulling out another cigarette. Who's the tall man at the back, Asuma-sensei? Ino asked. That's Team 7, sensei. Had Kakashi. They all took a close look at him and he seemed more a lunatic than a shinobi, let alone a jounin. Choji looked at him closely and then turned back to his sensei. Is he stronger than you? Yes, Asuma declared, no regret or doubt in his voice. Now that piqued Shikamaru. The night after the formation of Team 8, his mother, under the threat of releasing his childhood photos, had forced him to ask his father about his new sensei Tsurutobi Asuma. His father too had only complied under the same threat. But he had learned quite a lot, including how strong his sensei was. For someone to be stronger than him, well, let's just say they had to be pretty strong. The funny looking man greeted. Hello to you as well, Kakashi. Asuma nodded. How was the last mission? Oh, you know, the man answered cryptically. Shikamaru saw the look shared between the two jounin, which he roughly translated as let's talk about it later. Ino sized the man up. You don't look like a shinobi. Speak for yourself, Naruto interjected. This earned him a dirty look from her and he gave as good as he received, neither side willing to back down. The stalemate was broken by Kakashi, who guided his students away and presumably gave them instructions. Shikamaru had a feeling his day was about to become even more vexing than it already was. How troublesome. He was so going to get back at Kakashi for this later. Just last night, when Kakashi had come by with some Ichiraku takeaway, Naruto had told him all about that incident at the academy. There was nothing unusual about this, what with Kakashi being a jounin and frequently out of the village, they would meet up at each other's places every now and then and catch up. It made for some good bonding, as well as some nice stories to tell Kakashi's kids, when and if he had any. What he was cross about was Kakashi was having a good laugh at his expense. Naruto never forgot any insults, and the last person to insult him was Yamanaka Ino. And his sensei, despite knowing this, still paired him up with her. He approached her with no doubt as to how he thought of her, with a sour look on her face. We're heading to the Masamune, Phi. That's the name of a famous medieval Japanese blacksmith, combat utilities. That was the first place rated. The two walked in an entirely uncomfortable silence, exacerbated by the physical distance between them, Ino, because she didn't want someone to get the wrong impression seeing them walking with each other, and Naruto because of how slow she was walking. "Keep up will you," he called behind him. "Not all of us can walk as freakishly fast," she bit back. "And again, not everyone has extremely small feet like you." That did the trick. Ino walked forward in big strides, intent on stopping him in the middle of the road and giving him a piece of her mind. Thankfully though, by the time she caught up they were right in front of their destination. Masamune Combat Utilities. "Doesn't look all that much," Ino commented, taking in the small size and shanty appearance of the place. "Wait till you get inside," Naruto advised her. He led the way inside, the customary jingle of a bell indicating someone's arrival. He looked back at Ino, who seemed to be shocked at the setting around her. From the inside, the place was thrice as big than it appeared from the out. And the setup of the store was akin to a grocery supermarket, decked with aisles of weapons, clothing and tools segregated by their type, such as long-distance combat, hand-to-hand fighting, cold-weather gear, desert apparel and so on. "Who's there?" a voice called out from behind. A heavily bearded, large-rotund man appeared with a pair of safety glasses around his neck. Recognizing the boy in front of him, he went to him and gave him a slap on the back. "Naruto, it's been so long. It's nice to see you." Naruto rubbed his back, remembering why it had been so long since he'd been here. "Well you know, ninja life." He shrugged his shoulders, wincing at the pain it caused. Ino broke out of her disbelief at their exchange, now looking at Naruto with surprise. "You know him?" "Well of course I do. He's the best weapons maker in the whole Land of Fire. Any shinobi worth their trade knows him." Ino caught onto the insinuation he was making, but decided to let it pass this time. Masamune scratched his head, his cheeks flushed from the compliment. Now, Naruto-san, no need for all that." "Nonsense," Naruto affirmed, "you are the best. That's why all the Hokage himself cast this genjutsu upon your store." "What genjutsu?" Ino asked. Masamune's eyes twinkled in delight at her question. "Nice of you to ask. See, as a weapons store we can't ever have enough security. Since most of the village gets their supplies from here, the Sandaime agreed to help out," and he said an illusion. "From the outside, the place pretty much looks like a dump. On the inside though, I don't even need to tell you how wicked this place is." Your reaction said everything by itself. That much was true. The contrast between the exterior and interior of the place struck her like a bolt of lightning. But one question still remained to be answered. And how does the genjutsu stay active? I mean, even the Hokage can't have that much chakra, or any shinobi for a matter of fact. Naruto turned around at this statement, trying to hide the smile on his face. "I like you," Masamune beamed at her, "you're a clever kunoichi. As for how this setup is maintained, simple fuinjutsu." "What do you mean?" Naruto turned around at her question, always eager when the subject of fuinjutsu was mentioned, sealing jutsu. The ability to seal objects within another, most commonly inside a scroll. She paid him a backhanded compliment. "For someone that spent so much time outside of class, you seem to know a lot." Naruto regarded her coolly, "And for someone that spent so much time inside the class, you seem to know very little." Masamune intervened, not wanting his store to be the host of an adolescent shouting match. Now, play nicely kids. You're here on a mission, so do your job." Both of them agreed and after a quick look inside the store, went outside to look for a safe surveillance spot. In the end, they arrived at the same place, a small eat-in not much bigger than a Chiraku's. Seeing as it was just past lunchtime and business was going slow, all but 2 of the seats had been taken away. "Might as well eat something while we're here," Naruto commented, his stomach agreeing with him. "We're supposed to be looking out for any suspicious activity. And if we stand here doing nothing we'll be seen suspicious." Ino relented at his logic and stepped in, begrudgingly taking the only other place available next to him. A middle-aged woman in an apron and chef hat came to them. "Oh look," she gushed, "a young couple on their first date. Since it's your first time here, you each get your first dish free. We'll each take a miso ramen," Naruto requested, before Ino could interject and correct the lady. She smiled and went into the kitchen. After the lady left, Naruto subtly looked around the area trying to find anything useful. Ino, on the other hand, looked murderous. "What the hell?" She raged at him, "Why didn't you correct her?" He answered without even looking at her, "Well, for starters, it gives us a legitimate reason to be here." "We already have a legitimate reason to be here," a mission, Ino hissed. "That's only legitimate for us. I don't want the wrong sort of person finding that out." "And what's the second reason?" Naruto turned to look at her, a serious expression on his face. "We get free ramen." Ino had to compose herself to stop falling to the ground in exasperation. She shook her head at him, "You're worse than Choji." "Guilty as charged," he accepted and turned around to face the lady with 2 bowls of miso ramen. The lady placed their orders in front of them and clapped her hands together. "Happy eating, and I must say you two make for a very cute couple. I have to let Anata know that we're becoming a popular spot for couples." Anada is a term of affection for one spouse, either husband or wife. If only Ami could see me like this. Ino shuddered, unconsciously edging away from him. He noticed her movements and looked to her. What are you thinking about? It's none of your business. She snapped, her cheeks pink from being caught red-handed. Suit yourself, he shrugged and returned to his miso ramen, which he promptly began devouring. Ino scrunched her face in disgust. Can you not eat like a wild animal? I'm sorry I offended your precious sensibilities, oh princess. He monotoned with a dead expression on his face. I'll make sure to bow to your every whim from now on. Hey. Ino protested, only daddy gets to call me. She cut herself off at his incredulous expression, her cheeks turning pink at realizing what she had just revealed to him. He almost choked on his food from laughter. Your father actually calls you princess. And you still call him daddy. If they weren't on a mission, he would have collapsed on the floor from laughing so hard. So what? Ino challenged, her cheeks flushed. I'm his daughter, of course he'll say I'm his princess. Did your parents never? Ino stopped talking again, though for a different reason entirely. Naruto's eyes hardened and she fell silent, not wanting to worsen the situation. On his part, he completely ignored her, now slowly munching on his food and occasionally looking around. Hey Naruto, what are you looking for? She gently probed, trying to coax him out of his wall. He had zoned her out, instead focusing on the little girl wearing a floral dress, making her way towards Masamune's. It seemed very strange for a little girl to go unaided into a weapons shop and on her own choice. He wasn't a misogynist, but he had only ever seen one other girl gravitate towards the ninja arts at that young age, and she certainly hadn't dressed so femininely. Making up his choice, he placed a generous amount of bills on the counter and headed towards her. Follow me, he instructed his fellow blonde, who eager in her efforts to make up for her gaffe did the same and went after him. They slowly entered the store, kunai in hand, and Ino immediately tensed up. There were sounds of a scuffle coming from the back and her partner looked at her, whispering at her to stand by the door as he entered in. She nodded and went to her position. Clasping the door handle, she slowly unlocked and edged it open and Naruto soundlessly slipped inside the room. Ino followed suit and saw Naruto charging a masked figure atop Masamune's body. The person dodged the attack and threw a smoke bomb onto the floor. Ino covered her eyes and ears and by the time the smoke cleared the masked person was gone. To her left, a window fluttered in the air, a record of their person's getaway. Naruto gritted his teeth in anger and that's when she noticed just how bad the store owner had been hurt. Masamune-san. She rushed to him and her voice seemed to wake him up and he groggily pointed around him, talking of an intruder. She tried to get him to rest, please rest Masamune-san. The person ran away. But we have to get you to a hospital. He agreed and she somehow managed to get to him to the front of the store and gingerly placed him on a chair. Please wait here, I'll get Naruto and we'll take you to the hospital. She went back to the room where Naruto was staring at the wall as if trying to bore a hole into it. He needs to be seen by a doctor. Alright, but something's not right here. I can see that someone just attacked Masamune-san. For what reason? All the previous thievery was done at night and there was zero collateral damage. This doesn't seem like an incident of petty shoplifting to me. What do you mean? Ino questioned. She looked to the empty case of swords. There, those missing swords, that's your proof of theft. There isn't much use to stealing those swords, they're mostly ceremonial and probably haven't been used in years. Ino looked at him in confusion, then why did they steal those swords? I think it was to trick us, to divert us from their real goal. Which was? To kill Masamune-san. She flinched at the indifference which he said that and he struggled to roll his eyes in that moment. What now then? He looked at her hard, as if deliberating on whether or not to do something that he did not want to, and then he told her, take Masamune-san to the hospital. We can't let this person escape. And what will you do? Seeing his determined expression, she protested, you can't. We're just genin. That person could kill you. As a response to her plea he turned his back to her, his eyes seemingly boring holes into the wall. Ino shook her head in frustration and marched out the door, where Masamune-san was slowly recovering from his injuries. Gingerly helping him up, they moved out towards the local clinic. If this plan failed, he was pretty sure he would be fried to death on the electrical chair, courtesy of one Yamanaka Inoichi, the foremost mind walker and psychologist in the village. Inoichi disliked the term mind reader, insisting that the mind was not a book to be read and earmarked, but a journey to be experienced and traveled, from start to finish. All those fancy thoughts were nice and well, but if something happened to his daughter under Naruto's watch, and due to one of his crazy ideas, well he didn't even want to think of the outcome. That was why he crossed his fingers as she left the store, taking the injured to the hospital. Fortunately, she didn't make too much of a fuss, and when he heard the jingle of the door opening and them leaving, he let out a sigh of relief. Performing a tiger seal, he conjured a shadow clone and gave it the form of the little girl from earlier, the one that had come into the store and attacked the owner. He instructed it to follow them discreetly and to immediately combust should any danger present itself. With the clone following its targets, he closed his eyes and concentrated, focusing on the chakra around him for the second time that day. It truly was remarkable, this ability of his. He had a theory regarding this talent of his. Wherever there has been contact there must also be a trace. He could feel chakra of various people in this room, mostly likely prospective consumers. They were faint though, those sources. Some of the newer contacts he could taste on his lips. And he searched for the most recent one, which too was fast eroding. He stumbled back in shock, the truth striking him like a thunderbolt. The chakra was the same as the one from the forest. What the fuck? Someone was following them. Hailing from a family of mind walkers and being the heir of said clan, Ino liked to think she possessed a certain clairvoyance. And that special ability told her that they were being followed. She gripped the edge of her skirt unconsciously, feeling around for the weapon she had hidden there. It was one of the things drilled into her since she could remember. Never leave the house unprotected. She hoped that teaching would pay off, as she could sense the person coming closer. Duck. A voice yelled at them, and suddenly a force struck her, dragging her to the ground along with Masamune-san. She collapsed unceremoniously to the ground and caught a glimpse of Naruto moving towards the same masked figure from before. It ended with the same outcome. The person used a smoke bomb, and by the time Ino had checked on Masamune-san the smoke had dissipated, only this time Naruto was nowhere to be seen as well. She immediately feared the worst, though a moment later she heard Naruto jogging up to them from behind, looking at them with concern. "Are you guys alright?" She looked at him strangely. "Where did you go off to?" He looked at the ground closely, as if processing something in his mind. "I just tried to follow the attacker. Looks like they got the slip on me." His explanation didn't make sense to her. Unfortunately, Masamune-san groaned just then, and they shifted their attention towards taking him to see medical attention. Konoha Depot number 12. Sasuke was this close to tearing his hair follicles off. Hell, he was this close to burning his partner's stupid pineapple hairdo off. Seriously, who purposely made their hair like that? Why he had been paired with lazy-ass Nara was beyond him. The pineapple head had done nothing except lean against a window and stare at the sky all day long, with the same fucking blank expression all the time. First Sakura, now this guy. It was as if the universe was making a mockery out of his life, hindering him with incompetent fools who did nothing but suck at his blood. It was so tempting to burn off his stupid hair with a Kaiten jutsu, and so easy. And he was sure there would be very little in the way of ramifications. Sure, Shikamaru was a clan heir, but so was he, that too of the Uchiha. Although he didn't like using the privileges afforded to him, he'd definitely make an exception for the person currently grating on his nerves. "You're being troublesome." He tried not to make his feelings appear outwards, and he replied without looking at him, "We're here on a mission. Get up and do your job." The boy snorted in response, "At least I'm not pretending to be working." This time, Sasuke did look up at him, indignation burning in his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Shikamaru shifted in his stance before responding, "You've been looking at the same journal entries for the past 10 minutes. Well, perhaps I missed something the first time. And there could be mistakes in the entries. Highly unlikely. A job of this sophistication, they're unlikely to make such amateur mistakes. You sound like you've gotten to the bottom of these robberies." "It's too troublesome to explain," Shikamaru grumbled. "Not like you're doing anything." "Well, for starters, these guys don't seem to be common looters. They've targeted very specific locations: mail depots, weapons stores and food supplies. If I didn't know any better, I'd say these guys are here to stay." Sasuke raised an eyebrow. "You arrived at this conclusion based on such little information. It's not that difficult. I dare say they're shinobi, or at least ex-shinobi." "How?" "The first attack was on the food supplies, an indicator these guys were here to stay. Then, the weapons stores were targeted. And the final giveaway was the attack last night on the mail depots, particularly the fact that nothing had actually been taken from them." It wasn't often that Sasuke found himself struggling to follow a conversation, and this was indeed one of those rare occasions. It wasn't so much as the rationale presented, but the presenter himself, a boy frequently in last during their academy days, now running rings around the rookie of the year with his logic. Seeing the stumped expression on his face, Shikamaru begrudgingly expounded. "What is the most important thing to a shinobi? Information. About their mission, their target, the environment, any small information so as to prepare themselves accordingly." "Are you trying to tell me Konoha sends secret messages through the mail? Because that would be the very antithesis of secret. Anyone can read that information." "That's exactly what I'm trying to tell you. The messages are of course encoded, shrouded in innocuous phrases and sentences. Best to send them over post, where no one will suspect a thing, rather than through a secret communication channel. Even if the messages were intercepted, how would they be deciphered? The risk of a secret channel being exposed would make it much more difficult to send messages to spies in the future." Sasuke folded his arms, looking at the boy in front of him in a new light. "And you know all this how?" "The same way I know most things. My mother nagged me into asking my dad." Apparently the Jounin commander must be aware of the workings of the village's spy networks. You wouldn't know though, from the way my father lazes around the whole day. Speak for yourself. So what are we looking for? All the entries match up, there's nothing suspicious. That we know of. The letters could have been switched around, or someone could have gotten the key to decoding a message sent through one of letters, read the letter, decoded the message and left, without anyone the wiser. Sasuke wasn't pleased with the notion that he had been wasting his time and efforts all this long, which means that we were given this mission with the knowledge that we would achieve nothing of consequence. Not necessarily. I think the higher-ups wanted to see if we could find anything of substance. So this is a measure of our analysis and deduction skills. Precisely. Shikamaru stretched his body, and since you've confirmed that the quantity of letters is the same, we can get to working on what's within the letters themselves. He moved to a table, opening a letter and taking a pencil in his hand, and then looked at Sasuke expectantly. You do realize we're not supposed to snoop into people's private messages. Shikamaru looked at him dead straight. I'm aware of that. Are you coming or not? After a moment's hesitation, Sasuke joined him and together they began inspecting letters for any notable words or phrases. Shikamaru crossed a few words on the second line of a letter and looked at him. This line doesn't make any sense. Here we were delayed by a lot of puddles just outside Konoha. It hasn't rained around here for the past few weeks, so how can there be any puddles? Sasuke nodded, indeed. Puddle could be a code word for a mist ninja or a suiton user. A few lines below, another term caught Shikamaru's attention. He showed it to his partner. Here you have to try the roasted service berries they make here in Suna. Service berries only grow in the forest, so how and why would anyone be selling them out in the desert of all places? They continued in this vein for quite some time, and before they knew it the sun was slowly making its descent and they were required at the mission office. They locked up the place and headed back to report to the Chunin in charge. When they reached their destination, they were met by their respective teammates, who had apparently already given their verbal mission reports. After a quick sit-rep to their Jounin senseis and the mission handlers, who very surprised and impressed by their work, they were promised their work would be analyzed by the intelligence department and were told to enjoy themselves at dinner and to put it on the village tab. Just before exiting though, they were advised by the head mission handler not to talk about your work today with anyone, even your own teammates. Dinner was a segregated affair. Kakashi and Asuma were pretty much talking with each other, being the only two adults. Sakura and Ino sat next to each other courtesy of being the only two girls, happily exchanging juicy gossip stories. An awkward silence soon fell upon the boys. While Shikamaru and Choji were thick as thieves, neither had ever actually spoken to their fellow clan heir, and as the years had gone by their interactions with the hyperactive blonde had dwindled down, courtesy of the boy spending most of his education outside of a classroom rather than inside. For the two team's 7 members, the situation was even more uncomfortable. This was the first time they had ever met in a social setting, and both tried to avoid looking in the general direction of the other as much as possible. Doji, being the wholesome person that he was, tried to break ice. Hey guys, how's it been going recently? He slumped in dejection at the stone-dead silence his question was met with. Shikamaru turned to his sensei in exasperation. We're going to need alcohol. A lot of it. This got everyone's attention. The girls stared at him slack-jawed, shocked that he would suggest something like this. Shikamaru. Ino started. Don't start nagging Ino. It's alright for you too, but have you noticed how uncomfortable it's been on our side of the table? Ino put her hand down on the table, moral fury blazing in her eyes, and you think alcohol is the solution to that? He's not wrong, you know. Naruto spoke up. Alcohol lowers the inhibitions and causes the drinker to forget social barriers. Why don't you just admit you want to drink? He put his hands up in surrender, guilty as charged. The two boys turned back towards the senseis, a hesitant determination in their eyes. Kakashi gave them the one-eyed once-over before shrugging and calling for a waiter. Kakashi-sensei. Sakura admonished. Don't fret, Sakura-chan, a wise man once said that if you're old enough to kill, you're old enough to drink. Is this the same man who writes that garbage you read? The twinkle in her sensei's eyes gave her the answer. Ino narrowed her eyes at Asuma. You shouldn't be so irresponsible. We're your students, and not even adults yet. Asuma took a prolonged drag from his cigarette. You're not my students. Seeing her confused expression, he elaborated, you're my soldiers, to do and kill as I tell you to. That prevented any further dissent. The table grew silent, the genin taking in the implication of what they had been told and nervously waiting for what was about to occur, and the jounin closely observing them. Feeling their tension, Kakashi tried to test them. Besides, by the time we were your age our kill count was already in triple digits. Everyone looked at him with varying reactions. Ino, Sakura and Choji in trepidation of this revelation, while the other 3 boys looked at him carefully, searching for any trickery on his face. That's not a good thing, Sensei. Sakura spoke up softly. Asuma lit up another cigarette, looking at her at the same time, never said it was. Thankfully, their alcohol arrived at that time, and a cup of sake was laid in front of everyone. The Jounin clinked glasses and gulped down their drinks in one go, looking to the waiter for refills. Joji was surprisingly the first, slowly sipping the green liquid. He almost spat out the bitter taste out of his mouth, but somehow managed to hold on and had a pleasant smile on his face after he finished the cup. Emboldened by him, Naruto and Shikamaru clinked glasses like their senseis and drank in one go, coughing furiously as the alcohol went down their throats. Not going to be upstaged by her teammates or by Naruto, Ino did the same too, immediately regretting it as tears formed at her eyes from the sour tang of the sake. Following in her best friend's footsteps as she always did, Sakura too gulped down her drink and soon the two girls were giggling and chatting amongst themselves once again. Only Sasuke was left. He looked at the drink pensively and with a hint of longing. His mother had always preached to him to avoid the three shinobi vices: alcohol, women and money. But then again, she wasn't around to tell him that anymore. He looked around him, to the girls having a merry time, to the boys all hunched around a chessboard, the previous awkwardness eroded by the influence of alcohol. Being the loner that he was, he found it difficult to mingle with the others. Today was the first time he'd had a full-fledged conversation with a classmate apart from his blonde teammate, and even their exchanges were neutral at best. But there was a part of his brain, the part that was looking at the joy and laughter around him with yearning, that kept saying, "I want that." Making up his mind, he lifted the porcelain cup and drained its content into his throat. Ignoring the sting, he turned to the boys and laid a hand on Naruto's shoulder. "Hey guys, what are you doing? We're playing chess. Asuma-sensei always has one with him. You want to play?" Choji invited him. I don't know the rules of shogi, so I went with chess. Of course, his anti-socialness blocked by the pleasant sensation of alcohol, he went further. "I used to play with my father all the time." Naruto quickly spoke up, seeing the somber look on Choji and Shikamaru's face. "Let's play teams. Team 7 versus Team 10. Hi, Shikamaru accepted, and soon it was revealed to the male genin of Team 7 just how much of a genius the Nara heir was. Thankfully, Choji was hopeless and they were able to stay even. After a dozen or so games and a couple more cups of sake, the bill arrived. They kept discussing amongst themselves the results of their games, analyzing key positions and blunders. It wasn't until Ino thumped Shikamaru atop his head that they realized the restaurant was about to close. Looking appropriately ashamed, they quietly got out, red-faced and heads hung low. "Maybe we should get Sasuke-kun drunk more often," Ino whispered conspiratorially into Sakura's ear, viewing the drunken stupor of the Uchiha with amusement. Sakura's cheek pinkened, her mind undoubtedly running through such a scenario. Kakashi called for their attention. "Listen up now. Since the mission office was impressed by your stellar performance today, they've requested that we continue this assignment." "That's great, Kakashi-sensei," Sakura beamed. "I'm not done yet," he said, and through the gleam in his eye his genin knew they were in for an unpleasant surprise. "Tomorrow, we'll split up into the same duos as yesterday and investigate new places. I expect you all to show up for your assignments at the mission office 6 a.m. sharp." It took their alcohol-imbibed brains a few seconds to appreciate the message, and when they did they all collectively groaned. The other Jounin spoke for the first time since they exited the restaurant. "I'm sure you guys can make your own way home, right? There's something I have to do." "Does that something happen to be the sensei of teammate Asuma-sensei?" Ino asked slyly. Of course not. Now quickly, go home and rest. It's a big day tomorrow." Darting his eyes over Team 7 with the aim of damage control, he stopped at Naruto. "Ino's home is on the way to yours, right? I'd appreciate it if you could drop her off. I'd feel better." Sensing the boy was about to revolt, he spoke over him, "In fact, I insist." And with that, he disappeared, only leaving behind a pile of leaves. "Well, you heard the man. Choji and Shikamaru, your houses are close enough together, I'll trust you to get home safely. I'll drop Sakura home. Sasuke's house isn't too far away, and that leaves." "No way." Naruto objected, folding his arms like a petulant child forced to do extra homework. "Yes way. You were ordered by a superior officer of your village, and you will carry out the order. Besides, what kind of gentleman lets a lady walk home alone this time of the night? I ain't seeing no lady here." Before the two of them could get into it again, Kakashi grabbed Naruto's shoulder. "What?" His genin looked up at him. Searching for a reason, he spotted Ino's exposed arms. "Aha. Give Ino your jacket." "I'm not wearing a jacket," Naruto opposed, though he could see where the man was going with this. The Haddock smiled at him, "The one you have sealed away." Naruto stared at him with murderous intentions before acquiescing and producing the jacket. He held it out for the girl, holding the jacket away from his body. Ino slowly reached for the jacket and donned it, fixing her long hair in the process. "Well then, see you tomorrow," and with that Kakashi led Sakura to her home. Choji and Shikamaru did the same, whilst Sasuke gave a silent smirk at the remaining pair and turning away. She walked behind him closely, not wanting to upset him again. Ami knows I managed to do that this morning. It was pretty clear he hadn't forgotten that, the way he so resolutely ignored her, walking straight ahead without looking back once. It unsettled her. Hey Naruto. Getting no response, she plucked up the courage to touch his wrist. That stopped him in his tracks. He turned back to look at her and stared wordlessly. I'm sorry, she apologized, her eyes pleading him to accept. He removed his hand from her hold. Apology accepted and then continued walking ahead as if nothing had changed. Sighing in frustration, she followed him. Soon enough, they reached outside her home. He attempted to leave wordlessly, but of course that was not how things played out. Here, your jacket. It's alright, return it tomorrow. And with that he started moving away. Once again, she sought his arm. He turned around, with the intention of ridding himself of her, but then she went and looped her arms around his neck, hugging him. He stiffened, not used to such close contact with the fairer sex, particularly someone as pretty as Ino. You saved my life. His cheeks reddened, knowing that it was because of him her life was in danger in the first place. He tried to correct her, but then she looked up at him. The moonlight fell upon her, and her platinum hair turned a striking shade of silver. At such proximity, it was impossible to miss the fragrant aroma of roses that emanated from her. He looked her in her eyes, the moonlight dancing off her periwinkle eyes, inviting him to come closer. Perhaps it was the alcohol in his system that made him accept the invitation, and his arms unknowingly encircled Ino's waist and held her closer. She gave out an almost inaudible gasp, enchanted by the way his blonde spikes was illuminated by the backdrop of the full moon. His cerulean eyes were arrestingly beautiful, and she found her leaning in closer and closer. His breathing hitched, and she could feel his heart pounding against his chest. He closed his eyes, his instinct anticipating the contact. Ino smiled at his reaction. Boys will be boys. Her pride swelled at the fact that she was able to trigger such a response from him. Her lips moved ever closer to his face, and she pressed her lips to his cheek, just to the side of his mouth. Leaving his arms, she saw the look of longing and desire that haunted him, and turned around to enter her abode. She turned around to give him one last look, fleetingly looking at him before entering inside. Naruto touched the spot her lips had been, mere centimeters from his own. Now that she wasn't in his arms, and the fog of alcohol slowly cleared from his mind, he realized he had never told her the truth. Looking up to see a light go on, he smiled to himself. Some things were best left mysteries. The next day, Sakura hurried out the door. It was almost 6 a.m., and she did not want to experience whatever nasty surprise Kakashi-sensei had in store for her if she was late. As she dashed across the busy market streets, her body went on autopilot, honed from years of traipsing across these roads with her parents and friends. That allowed her to reminisce about last night. It had been a good experience for her. She did not have much friends, and her teammates, whilst cordial, were not someone she could have personal conversations with. And as much as Kakashi-sensei was growing on her, he had this lone wolf vibe that she doubted he would ever shed. It had been nice to see how her teammates were without inhibitions. If it weren't for the sad longing in Sasuke's eyes or the haunted look of isolation on Naruto's face, they could have almost passed as normal teenagers enjoying a night out with their friends. As a female, Sakura considered herself very observant, and from what she had seen, both boys had a history that bogged them down and prevented them from fully opening to others. And as their teammate, she took it upon herself to make them feel more comfortable, to bring forth the family element of their team. Besides, she would be lying if she didn't admit her curiosity. The tipsy version of Sasuke had shown to her a boy almost starving for interpersonal relationships and affection, and Naruto too had lowered his walls of solitude and mingled quite nicely. She was definitely going to ask Ino what drunk Naruto was like. Hurrying through the busy morning streets, she somehow stopped in front of her teammates and Team 10 at exactly 6 a.m. Thanking her stars, she caught her breath and joined her teammates. It's unlike you to be late, Sakura Shikamaru said. I went straight to bed last night to avoid my parents. It took me half an hour to get the scent of alcohol out of my mouth this morning. She saw Ino and Naruto share a quick look amongst themselves that no one else seemed to notice, and this only served to heighten her eagerness to have another one-to-one with her best friend. They entered the building and found their respective senseis waiting atop the stairs. Asuma held out 6 sets of keys. We did you the courtesy of arriving earlier and sorting everything out. Kakashi pushed off the wall he was leaning against. 3 neighboring farms have been ransacked. All the produce is missing, the crops are burnt and the animals either missing or slaughtered. Your job is to find anything of use. These keys will give you entrance to all the places within the respective farms, and we trust you to return these as you receive them. Sakura looked at her sensei, and where will you be? We've got a meeting with the Hokage. We have to brief him about yesterday's mission. The Jounin gave them their individual set of keys and gave them the directions to the farm, sending them on their way. 30 minutes later, they had arrived at the entrance of the farms, and the place extended as far as the eye could see. Sometimes she wondered just big her village was. She looked at the others. Naruto had a strange expression on his face, as if he were thinking about something completely unrelated to the task at hand. He stayed like this for a few moments before Ino came and tugged on his sleeve, taking him away towards their allocated farm. Now she was definitely curious. Something was up with those two and she wanted to find out what. Unfortunately, Choji came in the way. He greeted her with a polite smile and invited her to start their mission. Unable to think of a plausible enough reason to refuse and follow their teammates, she entered the farm behind him. After 10 minutes, she felt a tug in her gut. Her feminine instincts were tingling and a foul smell besmirched the arid air. She ventured further, cautiously feeling for the weapon that she kept on her person since her first day on Team 7. That uneasiness multiplied when she stopped in front of a large factory. Gulping in apprehension, she slowly opened the enormous doors alongside Choji, and what she saw inside left an indelible stain on her consciousness. Bodies. Dozens if not hundreds of them. Of sheep and chicken and pigs. Poor, innocent mute animals that had harmed no one, that had lived life so simply and harmlessly, all slaughtered and discarded like garbage. She struggled not to remove her breakfast, and her skin paled as she turned on the lights and saw the entire extent of the inhumanity. Stacked at the end of factory were the heads of sheep and chicken, and on the faces of some, she could see their pain and anguish, the pain of their final moments scarring her mind. She choked back a sob and ran outside. What kind of monsters would do this? Naruto was surprised by her boldness. After going home and replaying last night's events non-stop, he convinced himself that her actions were the result of her inebriated state. After all, the first time she had touched him he had granted her an introduction to his tenant. He had hoped it would be enough to deter her from manhandling him again. After all, he had not seen hair or hide of Kiba since their final day at the academy either. She held out her arm towards him. Thanks for lending me your jacket. He accepted it, trying to ignore the alluring scent of roses, and wondered when she had had the time to wash it. She stopped him again with her words. About last night. He prevented her from moving into dangerous terrain. It was your first time drinking, and you weren't in the right state of mind. No hard feelings. She looked to protest, but the detached, almost indifferent expression on his face deterred her. Nodding slowly, Ino offered a weak imitation of a smile and followed him inside. So much for being brave, she chided herself. It had been difficult to sleep last night when she closed her eyes and all she could see was the clear but repressed desire in his eyes, and she blushed at the ensuing thoughts that followed that line of thinking. She couldn't explain to herself why she had done what she had, because in that moment she had simply stopped thinking, only doing as her instinct mandated. And her instincts had been sent haywire at the image of his twinkling blue eyes and sparkling blonde hair in the silhouette of the moon. Stop it. You like Sasuke-kun, she scolded herself. Yet even as she did, she knew the last sentence was a question more than a statement. You do like Sasuke-kun? Last night she dreamt again, as most other nights. Except this time instead of a black-haired boy, a blonde invaded her fantasies. And instead of abandoning her he did something even worse, stalking her until a bright orange aura enveloped them and long arms lashed out at her until she felt nothing but pain. Her dreams stopped at that point and she woke gasping and breathless, her skin still stinging from the heat of the orange luminosity. Ino used the free time to wash his jacket, taking time and care in ensuring no spot was unmarked, taking out her frustration on the piece of cloth until it was bled dry. Back in the present, Naruto signaled a hand to stop as he suspiciously looked at the stables 100 yards ahead of them. Sniffing the air, his eyebrows widened, as if in horror realization, and he took out a shuriken from his pouch. Tread carefully. Gripping a kunai in her dominant hand, she followed him towards the stable. As they neared, she bit back the upsurge of bile in her esophagus. No wonder Naruto had that expression on her face. The truly repulsive smell was radiating from the stables, and a sense of trepidation seized her. She looked at him again, and if it were possible he seemed to be faring worse than her. His face was turning pink from the exertion of not trying to breathe, and it was a miracle he was still able to stay this focused on the task. They arrived at the door, and the foul odor occupied the space around them. They both closed their eyes, and Naruto twisted open the door handle. What she saw made her want to tear off her own skin. Corpses of farm animals, cattle and horse and mice, made up a mountain of savagery in front of her. There was blood smeared everywhere, even on the ceiling. She took a step back to turn around, but a warm, solid palm latched onto her wrist. As averse as he was to physical contact, a part of him recognized the importance of the greater good. They were shinobi, glorified murderers given a glorified persona. He had witnessed scenes a tenfold more gruesome, and so would she in time like any other ninja. It was better to start here, at a relatively young age and situation. These were still aphonic creatures, not of much more use to their owners than meat or dairy. Human beings were another matter. He still remembered the faces, even the ones mutilated beyond identification. She attempted to escape again, and he tightened on his grip on her wrist almost painfully. He ordered her to stay, and conviction in his tone forced her to. He felt a sudden weight on his shoulder and a pair of arms wrapped around him. Yesterday when she had done this, he had shrugged it off as intoxication. Now, there was no such excuse. A pretty girl was seeking comfort in his arms. He banished those treacherous thoughts to the darkest pits of his mind, silently castigating himself for his budding libido in such an inappropriate moment. Instinctively he turned around and did the same, turning them around so that her face was turned away from the atrocity and toward the sunlight peeking in through the stable door. He felt tears wetting his neck and silently cursed himself for not hitting his growth spurt yet. It seemed these days that there was very little he could do right. When she calmed down they separated and he could swear some of the light in her eyes had dimmed, lost forever to the realities of their cruel world. Part of him felt saddened by this and he shifted his mind back to nights under the stars with his godfather and stories of an ideal world where children would not have to kill or be killed and where he still had his parents. Should we try and clean this up? At least give them a proper burial, she requested, a hopeful plea in her voice. He felt his throat constrict but he did his best to stay composed. It's best we don't. There might be something useful to the forensics team. There were a lot of clues in the crime scene. Whether or not they were helpful or not, or even added up to anything was another question. She closed her eyes and lowered her head, a few mutinous tears making their way down her cheeks. He hated that look on her. By the time they had finished, the sun was making its way down the sky. A quiet tension gripped the air and the two walked in silence back the way they came. She still had a troubled expression on her face and for some inexplicable reason it kept bugging him. I have heightened senses, he blurted out. Why, he had no clue. But there was no use questioning it now. The fox was out of the bag. She broke from her gloom and eyed him in surprise, looking for an explanation. When we were going to he had to prevent himself from saying scene of mass slaughter. To the stable. I can't control them all the time and the smell was too much to handle. How do you have them? I don't know. I've had them since I can remember. Taking a sudden interest in the topic, she looked up at him. What's it like? Having amplified senses? Honestly, it's not too different most of the time. There's the rare times when it comes in handy, though as you just saw it does have its drawbacks. Really? What are some of the benefits? I can see a bit further, my eyesight is more acute, I can taste more flavors, and I can hear a bit louder. Ina raised her eyebrows. Does that mean you can hear in on private conversations? Yes, he admitted, but I don't ever do it unless it was teachers deciding what to teach in class. I would listen in and just skip school that day. She rolled her eyes at him. That's not even the coolest part, Naruto revealed. What is it then? I can predict when it's going to rain. He raised her hands for her to listen. Now before you call bullshit, just hear me out. She folded her arms and looked at him expectantly. He raised his arms up and declared, I predict it shall rain now. Almost in unison, sheets of rain started pouring down on them. Ino looked at him in astonishment, her mouth almost touching her chest. How did you know? Simple, he grinned, I just looked up at the clouds. She chased after him for that, a look of indignation etched onto her face. Imak ran away, staying close enough to tempt her to try harder. Tommy, it felt good to let loose. Sometimes he forgot he was only 13, just entering his adolescence. It felt relieving to act his age for once. By the time she tired, she collapsed to the ground and laughed at his antics. Naruto smiled and relished it. He was really beginning to like the sound of her laughter. She held a hand up and he obliged, picking her up. By the time she straightened her clothes, he had procured the only umbrella he had sealed, which coincidentally was big enough to just about fit the both of them. She searched his face for answers, and he revealed to her that it was a gift of his godfather's. What? The umbrella or the fuinjutsu? Both. Really? I didn't know you have a godfather. Who is he? Oh, you wouldn't know him. He's mostly traveling to promote his books. She seemed to take that as an acceptable answer, and he sighed inside in relief. What books his godfather wrote was not something he was too keen to divulge. It was a tight fit. Their shoulders bumped together, and Ino had to place her arms atop Naruto's to stay within the security of the umbrella. Thank you, Ino said. What for? He asked her. For cheering me up back there. That was the hardest I've laughed in a while. You noticed that? You don't hail from a clan of mind walkers and not pick up one or two hints into human behavior. Aren't you mind walkers? Naruto teased her. Don't get me started on that, she glared at him. Looking at him again, she probed, where was this Naruto yesterday? Where was this Ino yesterday, he countered. They shared a smile and understanding, and the rest of the way passed in companionable silence. Their teammates waited for them at the base of the tower. Shikamaru seemed to have been caught in the rain, and his hair was out of its usual ponytail. No one was looking at another, and it was apparent to him that they too had had a similar experience as Ino. They're just outside the Hokage's office waiting for us, Shikamaru replied. He made to open the entrance before Shikamaru's voice stopped him. Naruto looked back at him. What is it? I think there's something we should discuss before we head upstairs. When nobody objected, he carried on, for the past 2 days, we've been investigating crime scenes. Yesterday, it was nothing too extreme. Today, and he took a moment to steady himself, we were sent to a murder scene. Something that is way above our current rank, something that even a Chunin squad would not usually encounter. What are you trying to say, Shikamaru? Choji frowned. I think, and I told Sasuke as much yesterday, that we're being tested by the higher-ups. How though? Choji asked. It makes no sense. It does, Naruto piped up. They're trying to see how we'll handle tough situations, what our response will be like, and if we can carry out our mission in the face of adversity. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw Shikamaru narrow his eyes at him, no doubt having reached the same conclusion as him, and wondering how he had understood the real purpose as well. Why though? What would they hope to achieve? Sakura's hollow voice echoed out, her normally vibrant green pupils jaded by today's events. Sasuke stepped out of the shadows, they're trying to protect us. Ino folded her arms, they have a very unusual way of going about it. The Uchiha answered without looking at her, be grateful that the first dead bodies you saw were farm animals, rather than actual human beings. The others paled in response to his implication, and Naruto wondered if this was Sasuke's own way of conceding his own mental fragility. It would help us in the longer run to acclimatize ourselves to our job, and better for the village that its shinobi don't freeze in pressure situations, Shikamaru agreed. Doesn't mean I have to like it, Ino huffed. No one said you had to, and with that Shikamaru gestured for them to enter the building. Despite the events of the day bogging down on them, Naruto could still see the look of apprehension on the faces of the others as they stood outside the office of the Hokage. Yes, that included the lazy Nara. He couldn't fault them. The room they were about to enter was the highest station a Konoha station could achieve, the occupant a royal in all but name. Even the very air they were about to breathe was above their pay grade. Kakashi snapped shut his book, took you long enough. Sakura threw him a dirty look before falling into line behind him as they entered the Hokage's office. Jounin Haddock and Jounin Saratobi reporting with Team 7 and Team 10, Hokage-sama Asuma announced. The old man looked up from whatever he was reading to make his nose bleed, which was most likely cheap porn poorly concealed inside a thick book, and smiled at them. You just about made in time. First things first, how was the mission? He could see the calculating gaze behind the smile, and though it unnerved him, he definitely respected it. Even though he was the professor, the third could be as shrewd as a politician when required. He was testing them again. It was very eye-opening, Hokage-sama Naruto spoke out. And how so, Naruto-kun? It prepared us for our future as shinobi of Konohakagure no Sado, and gave us a glimpse of what we might encounter in the future. He then asked them to give a thorough verbal report, and once everyone had finished he simply smiled at them and congratulated them for a good job. That seemed to do the trick. Everyone's spirits lifted a bit as they exited, and to their delight, he gave them a good news. As a thanks for your valuable efforts, you can have the next 3 days off. Be sure to spend this time wisely. And with that, the Sandaime dismissed them. Just before turning around to leave, Naruto mouthed something. We have to talk. The old man gave the slightest of nods and looked away. Later that night, Konoha Council meeting. These allegations, compelling as they are, cannot be sole evidence of our allies breaching our trust, Hokage-sama Aburam Shibi objected. And they are not, Aburam-san the Jounin commander, Shikaku Nara revealed. They do not paint a pretty picture, Inoichi said, looking up from the sheets of data in front of him. And yet they are within the realm of plausibility here is encountered. And just implausible enough to be dismissed as drivel, Shikaku agreed. You have been lagging behind in your efforts, Saratobi the one-eyed man from the corner of the chamber frowned. Hiruzen smiled tightly at him, and that is why I have you, Danzo. To get to the root of every problem facing our village's safety. The man addressed glared at him, such treachery must be crushed mercilessly. The way you speak, Danzo-san, we must consider it confirmed. Heike Hiashi questioned, the ever-constant look of disapproval etched on his face. At this point the only thing remaining is a handwritten confession, and Yuzukatsume responded. In uncharacteristic fashion, Nara Shikaku stood up and fisted his hands on the table, exhibiting his impatience. I have a proposition, Hokage-sama. It would include another existing mission we've had in the books for quite some time. At his leader's nod to proceed, he expounded, there have been myths of a temple of sand for as long as one can remember. A secret facility hidden deep inside the desert that was once said to be the home of the Ichibi, and also where previous containers would go to be transformed and to re-strengthen their seal. There have been numerous failed attempts to locate this temple, many of our own. Last month, when Jiraiya-sama was touring Suna to promote his new book. A new one? Akimichi Chauza interrupted, his eyes furrowing in surprise. What's the name? Hiruzen slightly edged forward in his dais, eager to hear the answer. Seeing the enraged glare on Tsume's face daring him to answer that question, Shikaku's cheeks dusted pink before he sidestepped the question. I don't know. Anyway, back to the point. Jiraiya-sama met up with some of his local contacts, and he sent 2 transmissions over the channels only used for above top secret clearance. We decrypted them, and the first wrote of the mental instability and physical isolation of the Ichibi's container. The youngest child of the Kazekage? Inoichi questioned. Indeed. It is possible to deduce, given the fragile control the Jinchuriki has over its Biju, that the Temple of Sand would not be too far away. What do you propose, Shikaku-san? Hiruzen asked of his Jounin commander. Well, at any other time this would not be possible, but since Konoha is hosting this year's Chunin exams, it is an ideal opportunity. In fact, this is quite common between allying villages. You wouldn't be referring to the practice of sending an invitation through an envoy, would you, Nara-san? One preferably containing a close relative of the daimyo. Danzo anticipated, whatever visible of his face contorting into an unsightly smile. Correct. And of course, any relative of the daimyo would have to be well protected. Several jounin in fact would be required to ensure the security of such an important figure. And it would be seen as a great disrespect if they were not hosted by the Kazukiage himself, which conveniently for us is right next to his children's residence. Tauza slapped his old friend on the back. Every now and then, Nara, when you get off that lazy hide of yours, I'm reminded why you're a genius. Shikaku rubbed his aching back and carried on. The next message wrote of a very disturbing scenario. It mentioned shinobi and civilians, both suddenly disappearing near the border of the lands of wind and rain. One of the many reasons we found this alarming was this was the last established location of the missing nin Orochimaru. Even here, deep within the safety of the village hidden in the leaves, the name Orochimaru darkened the chamber and made everyone stiffen in their seats, and the smoke from Saratobi's pipe felt just a little less warm and comforting. Another cause for concern was that often these people would return, only to drop dead instantaneously and shapeshift into other people. From the corner of his eye he saw Danzo tighten his grip on his cane, and he filed that away as another question he would need answered. What you are suggesting, Naradono, would break the laws of nature? Hiashi frowned. Only the laws we know, Hiruzen answered. Shibi readjusted his glasses and looked to him. Only one person could be capable of such perversion, Hokage-sama. Which makes any effort we make at getting to the bottom of this even more precarious, he agreed. He could feel Inoichi's gaze on him, perhaps wondering if he would reveal what they had seen in that torture room to the others. He had no intention of doing so. It would cause mass havoc, which was the last thing needed if the situation was as dire as he feared. Shikaku continued his revelations, and as far as we know, there has been no official enquiry into this matter, either by the Wind Daimyo or the Kazukiage. The Sand must be ensuring their daimyo is kept in the dark. He was always a gullible fool, Danzo sneered. Hiruzen thought on it for a moment and then decided to give the go-ahead. It is a good plan, Shikaku. Write an official mission request, and I would see to it that the correct personnel are assigned to it. I would volunteer some of my own shinobi, Saratobi, Danzo claimed. Your shinobi, Danzo-san? I was under the impression that we are all under the branch of the leaf. The Haika head checked. Indeed, as am I. It is only that some are under my jurisdiction, the cripple lied smoothly, and Saratobi smiled slightly as his childhood rival was forced to eat his own words. Hiruzen smiled tightly at him. Nevertheless, your magnanimity is well appreciated, Elder Danzo. But we can manage with irregular forces. Now I must go and send word to the daimyo, and with that he dismissed the council. It was going to be another sleepless night. 0600 The next morning, the office of the Hokage. Kakashi was simultaneously impressed and far from impressed at the same time. Impressed at the sheer scale of magnitude and planning involved in such a short time, and far from impressed due to his role in it. He had been summoned at quite an ungainly hour to his Hokage's office, where he was shortly joined by a purple-haired Kunoichi, whose name was on the cusp of his tongue. Mitarashi Anko. She helped him out and he smiled gratefully at her. I knew your name. At her ugly look, he fittingly looked away ashamed. I must apologize for inviting the two of you in here so early in the day. No need to apologize, Hokage-sama, you must have a very good reason to, the Kunoichi assured him. Then, they were explained the preceding events, from Sasuke and Shikamaru discoveries in the letters to the messages they had received from an unnamed spy. Kakashi had a very good idea who that was, and then the overnight communication Saratobi had with the daimyo, who had agreed to sending an envoy with his daughter as the lead. At the end of the third speech, he was more than blown away what he had just heard. This is quite the plan you have set in motion, Professor Sama, Kakashi praised, regarding the man sat in front of him with deep respect. The third addressed the other person in the room. What do you make of these, Anko-chan? I can see why Suna would do this, but I do not think this is proof enough of betrayal. Kakashi looked at her closely. What makes you see why they would do this? After the last war, where we basically saved Suna from being run over, a new trade deal was accepted, which pretty much crippled them. They have since found ways to get by, but I'm sure there is still some hostility brewing. And that is why this is necessary. Your mission, should you accept to choose it, would be threefold. The most obvious is the safety of the daimyo's daughter. I have not informed the daimyo the real purpose for this trip, so you must make sure she does not have any suspicions. The second is to investigate these strange occurrences on their borders. Again, be discreet and if you must, feign identities if you feel it would help progress the mission. The third, when you get to Suna itself, is to find out whatever possible about the Temple of Sand. No detail, no matter how minor or accessory it may seem, should go uninvestigated. Do I make myself clear? They nodded their assent and the third looked at them carefully before proceeding. And the last important piece of information, which I have deliberately withheld for after you have agreed to this mission, is that you will be going undercover. And how will we be doing that? Anko asked, folding her arms. Kakashi suspected he knew the answer. As a married couple. Who will be backup assistants to the head chef. To their credit, neither complained. Instead, they just began firing questions. How would we pull it off? Won't my mask seem suspicious? We don't know the first thing about the other. What if we actually have to cook something? Sarutobi sighed and put a hand up. It had the intended effect. Their protests died down immediately. The uncertainty is not lost on me. I will answer all your questions if you give me the opportunity to. When neither spoke up, the Hokage continued. To answer the first question, once we are done here, the two of you are going to meet a marriage counselor who will help you get into character. Kakashi, for this mission your mask will have to come off. Do not worry, you will not be forced to show your face to anyone. Both your hair will be dyed and a bandage will be applied to your face. You can say you were burned in a kitchen accident. I believe the marriage counselor will also help for you. Third question. And as to the last question, you will not be going anywhere near a kitchen. You are backup assistants, added at the last minute. You would have no reason to have any contact with her. Do you have any more questions? Kakashi mutely shook his head and they were sent off to meet the marriage counselor. 2 hours later, training ground 3. Weren't we supposed to have the next 3 days off? Kakashi-sensei, Sakura griped. Kakashi smiled at her. You still do, Sakura-chan. I just called everyone here for an important announcement. Well then, get on with it, Sasuke grumbled, clearly displeased at being woken out of bed. I'm going to be gone for the next week or so on a mission out of the village. In that time, I want you to keep working on your training. After your break is over, I have arranged for Kurenai-sensei of teammate to train you until I return. I do not want any complaints from her about your attitude or ability, and everyone is to be on their best behavior. Do I make myself clear? Zenin nodded at him. Good. Any questions? Sakura raised her hand up like she was still in the academy and spoke before he could tell her she didn't need to raise her hand anymore. Where are you going, sensei? That's something I can't disclose to you. One day when you have your own team of genin you'll understand why. Now, any questions not related to my absence? After a minute of silence, he nodded and dismissed them. He really hoped this worked. He wasn't really worried about Naruto and Sasuke, those two would continue training as normal. It was Sakura he was worried about. Though he had succeeded in slowly improving her work ethic, it was still nowhere near enough of genins. He had even asked Kurenai to get her Kunoichi genin to work with Sakura in the hope of motivating her, but when he'd heard about her own self-doubt and lack of confidence, that was no longer an option. He sighed. It really was going to be a long week. Naruto clan archives. Shikamaru had only been in this place a handful of times and each occasion was more troublesome than the next. He supposed this would be the most troublesome yet. He had not slept last night. That alone was cause for concern. Normally he could put his head down and it would be lights out in moments, but last night he tossed and turned around in his bed as one question kept nagging him like his mother. Why? Why kill farm animals? He could understand killing people, even though he had been fortunate enough to not be in that scenario himself. People lied, cheated, mocked and hurt one another. All understandable reasons to take a life, if not pardonable. But these farm animals had not harmed anyone, apart from the odd harasser or two. And then there was also the manner of the killings. Far as he knew, only these 3 farms had been targeted. Each had housed different species. Choji and Sakura went to the one with sheep, chicken and pigs. Naruto and Ino got the farm with horses, donkeys and cattle. The farm he and Sasuke inspected was the odd one out. It was a farm for non-mammalian creatures. They had seen disfigured snakes, slugs and toads. That fact stood out to him for some reason. He remembered reading about those 3 animals and their significance to Konoha, he just couldn't remember what. He had made pointers on paper, all the things that stood out to him. For example, all the male cattle had been dehorned, all the poisonous snakes were missing their venom glands, and the pigs and mice were missing their heart and brains. Organ harvesting seemed unlikely, not on such a scale or with the barbarity with which the animals had been dismembered. That's why he was here in the clan archives. Searching for reasons behind this depravity, or perhaps even a previous similar act. Access to these parts of the archives was only for the highest-ranking members, which he now joined as the clan heir after becoming an official ninja. He buried himself in the criminology section, and it wasn't until hours later that he stumbled upon a mission report which he would regret after reading that he had ever found. Even reading it made him want to be sick. Archive number 14,688,641, Easter egg. The first 4 digits are the number of missions Orochimaru has completed, and the next 4 are the same number in reverse. Mission report. Nara Shiken, Fiat means stem or complete. Rank. Jounin, Anbu. Mission type. combat. At 6 o'clock a squad of 4, including the Hokage and 2 other Anbu whose names I am not privy to, left the Hokage tower to question and possibly arrest if need be, Orochimaru of the Sannin. We had received information of a secret hideout that the man maintained at the outskirts of Training Ground 44, also known as the Forest of Death. Personally speaking, I felt quite favorable about our success. Strong and evil though our target, we had the Lord Hokage, the god of shinobi, with us. What we saw in there is something that will forever haunt my consciousness. The man, if he could even be considered human anymore, had been conducting experiments on test subjects both live and dead. Though from my vantage point, it seemed more like torture and desecration than any actual scientific inquiry. The test subjects were both human and non-human. Immediately, we tried to apprehend the now criminal and preserve the room as evidence. Unfortunately, he was prepared. I do not know how Orochimaru could have been aware of our arrival, but he pressed a button below on his desk and suddenly hot air started fizzing into the room. Realizing what it was, we all got out as soon as we could and we made it out just as the explosion sounded behind us. We rushed back in as soon as we could and what we saw was the charred remains of once healthy living beings. There were considerable efforts, of course, to determine how Orochimaru could have left that room, as well as to retrieve anything from the room to figure out what the sadistic sinner had been working on. Unfortunately, none of these efforts bore any fruit and from little we could gather, it was presumed that more of these locations existed and since then the Leaf has sought to find, examine and eradicate them. He felt ill and his stomach felt queasy all of a sudden. His thirst for knowledge had been doused by the perversion he had just read. There had been lessons of the great Sannin at the academy, of 3 warriors of great strength who had won Konoha the Second Shinobi War. Beyond that though, there was little mention of them. Now he understood why. The actions of one had banished them to a mere footnote in the history books, at least of this village. And unjust as it was to the other 2, Shikamaru agreed with that decision. This Orochimaru fellow seemed like a wicked monster, straight out of the books his mother used to read him, who would come devour him if he didn't go to bed on time. Shikamaru hoped he would never have to cross paths with someone like this monster. How wrong he would turn out to be. After dinner, he approached his father in his study. "Oyaji, I have something to ask of you." His mere presence in the study raised his father's eyebrows. "It is unusual of you to come here, even more so to ask me about something unrelated to chess." Shikamaru dove straight to the heart of the matter. "I read archive number 14,688,641. His father closed what he was reading. "I see. And what is it about that particular dossier that brings you here?" I wanted to know more about Orochimaru. For some reason, the room seemed a bit more dark as he said the name and the chimney fire just a little less vibrant. Orochimaru, his father contemplated, was a complex case. He was orphaned at a young age and he always possessed a flexible morality. Still, with immense shinobi skills and a genius intellect, alongside the training of the 3rd, he became one of the pillars of the village, a true war hero. He was even in contention to become the 4th, and when someone else was awarded that privilege, it is speculated to crushed whatever loyalty he had towards the village. He was rarely seen in public and after a while he began mingling with the wrong crowd. Suddenly, abduction rates started to spike in and around Hai no Kuni, the land of fire, and multiple investigations implicated him. And the rest you know. But what happened to him? Did he manage to escape? Did they find any more hideouts? Shikamaru felt a calculating gaze on him and he could see the man in front of him was not his father now, but the Jounin commander of the village hidden in the leaves. To this day, we have had no official confirmed sighting and he is presumed dead in our record books. And as of yet, we have yet to find such similar sites, though we are still alert for any information on that front. He paused for a moment, wondering if he should ask his next question and if his father would even have any answers. He had wondered about this particular topic for years, at first not giving it much thought, but it had been at the center of his mind since a few hours. "I wanted to ask you about Naruto." This time, he was met with a hard stare. "I understand you have been carrying out missions with Team 7, any questions you may have about them would be best answered by themselves or their sensei." He turned around in frustration, but his father hadn't stopped speaking. "Remember a long time ago when you asked me why adults seemed to dislike him? I told you then to form your own opinion of him and I believe you had done so. Perhaps now, when you are seeing a different side of him your perceptions may have changed. It is one thing to tell you about a criminal, a S-rank criminal long before your time, but when it is your comrade and someone who used to be your friend, you must speak to them yourself." As soon he answered those questions, he turned around and busied himself in a report, gently but firmly ushering Shikamaru out of the room and away from this conversation. He wasn't dumb though, he could read between the lines and figure out what he was really being told. As much Shikamaru appreciated his father trying to shield him, there were a million questions more he wanted to ask him. But he understood this was not the time. He took one last look at the Nara clan head, wondering if one day he would ever have to do this, and left the room. The next evening, Naruto felt a hard gaze on him. You are sure of this? Hi, Professor. The third lit up a new pipe and a Shen look on his face. I have always had my doubts, but this goes beyond a mere power struggle, it straddles sedition and treachery. What would you do? He was met with a blank look. Sometimes, he forgot that the man in front of him was the Hokage first and his grandfather second. We will have to deal with it best we can. I thank you for letting me know, Naruto-kun, but this is something I must take care of with extreme secrecy. The less people are privy to this, the better. He nodded, understanding that the Hokage had to care for the village first. If that is all, you can enjoy the rest of your day off, and with this he left the office. Once he left, Hirazen's face sunk further. Danzo had long since plunged into the madness, but he had foolishly believed he could channel that darkness towards the betterment of the village. How wrong he had been. If his men were involved in carrying out hits on Konoha's citizens, then what else had the man sunk his claws into? Was he really even looking after the village? Or just his own selfish goals? There would have to be a lot of changes now. This could not be allowed to continue. He would lobby, no decree that members of the regular forces be involved in nighttime patrolling. Hirazen sighed. He was getting too old for this. Hey Naruto, what are you doing here? The blonde whipped his head around to see his cherry-haired teammate jogging towards him, bags of groceries weighing her down. He smiled at her. Hey Sakura. Nothing, I was just passing by. Good. Since you're doing nothing, help me carry these home. Before he could object, she thrust the bags into his hands and started walking. He grumbled in protest before following. So how's your day been like? Sakura asked, trying to make small talk. Same old. Woke up early for some training and then just decided to take a walk around town, he lied easily. What about you? He asked in case she got any more curious. Oh, nothing much. Had a bit of a lay-in today, read some books and helped my mom around the house. These groceries are actually for dinner. Naruto found he had nothing to respond with, so he just quietly followed her the rest of the way. Her house had a very homely feel to it. He supposed that was true of all houses with parents, in stark contrast to the uninviting silence that permeated his orphan apartment. He stopped at the gate, placing the groceries down and saying goodbye. At least come in, my parents have been dying to meet my teammates. He raised an eyebrow at her, and since you can't get Sasuke over, I'm the next best thing. She blushed, knowing this was true. Their standoff was broken by the door opening and a pretty lady walking out. There you are, Sakura-chan, I was wondering how long it would take you. Looking at Naruto, she looked back at her daughter. And who is this? A new friend. Do introduce us, dear. That's Naruto, mama. My teammate. Oh yes, Sakura's told me all about you. She says you're very strong. Now it was Naruto's turn to blush. Well then, what are we doing standing here? Let's go inside. I really should leave, Naruto started, but he was quickly ushered in by the Haruno matriarch. You can leave the shopping in the kitchen, I'll sort that out. Naruto-kun, what would you like to have for dinner? Oh, Naruto fumbled. Naruto likes ramen, Mama Sakura answered. Ramen it is, then her mother decided. I've been meaning to have you over, dear, the both of you. Both of us? Naruto questioned, wondering who this other person was. Yes, you and Sasuke-kun. Now go and do whatever it is kids do these days, dinner will be ready in a few hours. Wait, but Naruto started before he was pulled outside again by Sakura. As they left the house, he removed his hand from hers. Did your mother just invite me to lunch? He frowned at her. She didn't invite you, silly, it was an order. And what's with the long face? Mama might not be a Chiraku, but she makes great ramen. That's not the point, Naruto grumbled. Well then, what is the point? Sakura asked. Forget it. Let's get Sasuke. Do you think he'll come? Sakura asked, a hint of longing in her tone. He would have rolled his eyes at her girlishness, but he was too busy formulating a plan to get the Uchiha to Sakura's house. I won't give him an option. If I'm going down, he's coming with me. That last part stopped Sakura in her tracks. You make it sound so bad. All I'm trying to do is get to know my teammates better. Am I really that bad? Sakura whispered, and he realized he'd said something he shouldn't have. Wait, no, he bumbled, cursing his lack of social awareness. It's alright, Sakura said, even though Naruto could see through her act. He kept quiet, not wanting to make things worse. In a wordless silence, they reached Sasuke's home. Before she rang the bell, he stopped her. Hey listen, about earlier, I was just being an idiot. Don't take any of it to heart. Before she could reply, the door swung open and they were met with the ever-scowling face of Uchiha Sasuke. Their teammate narrowed his eyes at both of them. What do you want? Limo. Kurenai-sensei called us for practice, Naruto blurted, knowing there was no way the boy would agree to the truth. Sasuke crossed his hands. We don't have practice for another 2 days, idiot. We don't, but Kurenai-sensei asked if we wanted to start before. She wants to meet up outside my house. Naruto turned a fraction towards her, appreciating her backup despite inadvertently insulting her. And why your house? Hell do we know. Maybe she likes the view. She just told us to come get you. Sasuke stared at them unblinkingly for a moment and they feared he'd seen through their bluff. Fine. Something was wrong. Sasuke couldn't exactly tell what exactly, but he had this sense he was being lied to. Why though? He had no qualms beginning training earlier, he'd just finished some independent workouts. It would be beneficial to learn alongside a tracking team, he needed those skills to hunt that man. He looked back at his teammates, who were walking suspiciously behind him, as if they were worried he'd run away. If they continued looking at him like that he might very well go back. 5 minutes later, they reached the outside of the Haruno household, only there was no teammate or Jounin sensei present. He looked at them, well, where is she? Naruto looked at Sakura purposefully, maybe she went inside to talk to Sakura's parent. Why don't you go inside and check? We'll wait outside for you. The girl nodded her head enthusiastically before scampering in. Naruto looked around nonchalantly, whistling a hideous tone. That was the tell. Something was definitely wrong. Using what he hoped was his angriest voice he glared at the blonde, you better tell me what's really going on Naruto. Naruto shrunk, looking at the door as if wishing someone would walk out. There you are Sasuke, a feminine voice rang out. Sasuke turned to see an adult version of Sakura walk out of the door. Where is Kurenai-sensei? Who? The lady asked politely. Before Sasuke could figure out what was going on, he felt a warm hand squeeze his cheek. You're such a cute boy. Just like Sakura's dad. Mama. Sakura yelled, scandalized by what was going on. Oh don't worry. I'm sure Sasuke has heard that from a lot of girls. You as well, considering you talk about him so much. He could see their other teammate red-faced, struggling not to die out of laughter. He growled, Naruto was so dead. Sasuke nearly swatted the hand off his face. What is the meaning of this Sakura? He'd feel sympathy for her if he wasn't in such an embarrassing position himself. What it means is Naruto answered between labored breaths, is that Sakura's mom invited us for dinner. Indeed, she beamed. There's still a couple hours left, so go and have some fun. Boss Sasuke complained, but they were ushered out by Sakura's mother. I'm going to kill you he promised them. Maybe, but I'll see in a couple hours Naruto said as he set off. Sasuke stopped him where do you think you're going? Did she pull your ears out with your cheeks? We have a couple hours before dinner. I'll be home till then. No, you won't. You can't just trap me like this and walk away. I won't let you. He'd see the hurt look on Sakura's face if he weren't so mad with Naruto right now. Fine then, Naruto shrugged what do you think we should do in the meantime? Maybe we could just walk around town Sakura suggested. And that was that. Somehow, they ended up walking to Mount Hokage. Race you to the top. She yelled and started running without looking back. She laughed when she heard the boys' protests and even harder when she felt 2 gusts of wind pass her by as her teammates started competing with each other. She reached the top some 15 minutes later and stopped for breath. Her chest was on the brink from laughing and running and she saw the boys leaning against trees. So who won? Who do you think? Naruto smirked. I think Sasuke she lied easily and giggled at the outraged expression on Naruto's face. You cheated Sasuke accused him. I did not. I went from a shortcut. I didn't know there was a shortcut. Sakura asked, why don't you take us there? But Sakura. Yes Sasuke agreed, surprising her. I want to know this shortcut of yours. The smile on Naruto's face dimmed slightly and for a moment she thought he would say no. But then he turned around and told them to follow him. Naruto wasn't sure about this. By taking them to this place, he was giving them a glimpse into who he was and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. Not that he didn't trust them, but someone as smart as them could very easily figure out the surveillance potency of such a place. And if they could figure that out, what was next? He knew Sasuke already suspected many things since their team was formed and as good-natured as Sakura was even she would want answers at some point. They arrived quicker than he would have liked. Wow, this place is very beautiful Naruto Sakura gushed. And to think you've been hoarding it to yourself all these years Sasuke scoffed. How often do you come here Naruto? Often. It's very peaceful. And it gives a live view of most of the village Sasuke observed. Naruto tensed for a moment, thinking Sasuke was onto something, but then the Uchiha turned around and examined the place. Nobody ever comes along this path. Far as I know no one else probably knows about it. Who made it then? The sculptors of the mountain perhaps. A secondary path to ground in case of a landslide. Sasuke looked at him, you've given this a fair bit of thought. I've been up here a fair many times. Then Kami Sakura interrupted at that point. Hey guys, it's getting late. We should head back for dinner. The way back was uneventful. Most of the shops were closing down and the cold wind surrounded them in a cloak as they quietly went back to Sakura's place. Sakura's mother was waiting for them at the entrance. She greeted them warmly and took them in. Almost immediately he was struck by the scent of an appetizing dinner. He fought the urge to run away. The last time he'd been in such a place was the last day of his parents' lives. The washroom's just over to the right. Go freshen up and we'll have dinner. Dinner consisted of ramen and grilled fried rice. He saw the anticipation build up on Naruto's face and he almost rolled his eyes at the blonde's juvenility. He looked down at his plate and swallowed the rice. An involuntary sigh came from his mouth. It was just like mother's. His eyes remained closed, trying to rein in his emotions. It was the simple things that always got to him. Homemade food, a mother nursing her child, a father buying his child ice cream, or a brother carrying his younger on his shoulders, simple gestures that served to remind him of what he'd once had and had been snatched from him. He felt a warm hand rest on his shoulder. "Are you okay, Sasuke-kun?" It was Sakura's father. "Yes sir," and with his best imitation of a grateful smile he half lied, "It's that this food is very delicious. I was just taking the time savor it." His teammates looked at him in disbelief, no doubt